a recovered field log from Operation High Jump. Before we begin, I want to thank Don Welsh for this extraordinary story idea. What you're about to read changed everything I thought I knew about what lies beneath the ice. They told us it was a training mission. They lied. I watched a plane explode over water so cold that the fragments froze before they hit the surface. I saw men vanish into white nothing and never return. I stood on the deck of the Mount Olympus while Admiral Byrd, hands shaking, told us about aircraft that moved at speeds we couldn't comprehend, piloted by something that definitely wasn't human. And I learned why, 70 years later, no civilian can enter Antarctica without permission from governments that supposedly don't own it. This is my account. These are the pages they tried to destroy. If you're not reading this, then I succeeded in keeping at least one copy hidden. What follows is the truth about Operation High Jump, and why we were ordered never to return. August. The orders that never matched the cover story. The summons came on a Tuesday in late August, delivered by courier to my apartment in Washington. No return address, no explanation, just coordinates and a time. I was a junior intelligence officer then, fresh from the war, still young enough to believe that orders always made sense. The Navy had kept me in analysis work, studying radio intercepts and movement patterns. Quiet work, safe work, nothing that would prepare me for what was coming. The briefing room was deep in the Pentagon, down corridors that required 3 separate security checks. Rear Admiral Richard E. Byrd stood at the front, looking older than his photographs, his explorer's face lined with something I couldn't quite read. Not exhaustion, not fear exactly, resignation maybe. There were 30 of us in that room. Intelligence officers, communication specialists, cartographers, all with top secret clearances, all chosen for reasons we wouldn't understand until much later. Byrd's briefing was efficient, almost clinical. Task Force 68. 13 ships, 23 aircraft, 4,700 personnel. The largest Antarctic expedition ever assembled, to be launched in December when the southern hemisphere summer made the ice barely navigable. The official designation was Operation High Jump. The official purpose was training and mapping, testing equipment and tactics in extreme cold weather conditions. The official duration was 8 months. Everything official was a lie. The Admiral waited until the official briefing materials were distributed and filed before he spoke again. This time his voice was different, quieter. The voice of a man who knew his words would be buried under classification stamps and denial. We were to prepare for aggressive engagement if necessary. We were to maintain armed readiness at all times. We were to report directly to him, bypassing normal command channels on any anomalous observations. Anomalous, that was the word he used. Not unusual, not unexpected. Anomalous. As if they already knew something was down there. I raised my hand, young, stupid, still believing that asking questions was part of my job. What exactly are we expecting to engage, sir? Byrd looked at me for a long moment. In his eyes I saw something I would see again and again in the months to come. The look of a man who knew too much and wished he knew nothing. That's need to know, Lieutenant. And right now, you don't need to know. But I would learn. We all would. Over the next 3 months we prepared. Not like a research expedition. Like an invasion force. The ships were combat vessels, refitted for ice navigation, but still carrying full weapon systems. The aircraft were armed. The personnel were combat veterans, chosen not for their scientific expertise, but for their ability to follow orders under fire and keep their mouths shut afterward. We trained for engagement with an enemy we couldn't name. We practiced communication protocols for reporting contact with something the briefing materials only ever called them. We rehearsed evacuation procedures that assumed casualties, and through it all the official story remained unchanged. Training mission, mapping expedition, testing equipment in extreme conditions. Nobody believed it, but we all pretended to. On December 2nd we shipped out from Norfolk. 13 vessels cutting through the Atlantic toward a destination none of us truly understood. I stood on the deck of the Mount Olympus and watched America disappear behind us, and I remember thinking that I was watching the last of the world I knew. I was right. December, the first week in Antarctica. We reached the pack ice on December 26th. The sun never set this far south in summer, just circled the horizon in an endless loop that made sleep nearly impossible. Time became meaningless. Day and night merged into one continuous present tense of white and cold and waiting. The ice was wrong from the beginning. I say that now, with all that came after, but even then I knew something was off. The way it moved, the patterns it formed. Ice shouldn't have structure like that, shouldn't create geometric shapes that repeated with mathematical precision across kilometres of frozen ocean. The cartographers noticed first. Commander Hawkins, a man who had mapped coastlines across 3 oceans, spent an entire day staring at his charts with an expression of pure confusion. "It doesn't match," he said finally, jabbing his finger at the maps. "Nothing matches. The coastline is different. The depth soundings are impossible. This isn't what Byrd found in 39. What do you mean different?" He looked at me like I was asking him to explain why water was wet. "I mean the continent is in the wrong place. Or we are. Or something is very, very wrong with our instruments. But it wasn't the instruments. We checked and rechecked every piece of equipment. The radios worked perfectly. The depth sounders gave consistent readings. The compasses pointed north with unwavering accuracy. The problem was Antarctica itself. It wasn't where it should be. Or we weren't. Or the maps were drawn of some other place that only looked like the bottom of the world. On December 28th, we made first landing at Little America. The base Byrd had established years before still stood, half buried in drift but intact. Abandoned. Empty. Too empty. Lieutenant Morrison led the first recon team inside. He came out 20 minutes later, face pale, holding a logbook he found in what had been the radio room. The last entry was dated December 1945, just over a year before our arrival. But Little America had supposedly been abandoned in 1941, evacuated ahead of the war. Someone had been there, someone had kept that log, someone had written, in careful block letters on the final page, "They came back. We're leaving while we still can." Byrd confiscated the logbook immediately. It was filed under magnetic anomaly reports. I never saw it again. That's when the radio interference started. At first it was subtle, static on frequencies that should have been clear, gaps in transmission that lasted just slightly too long, words that came through garbled, not from distance or equipment failure, but as if something was translating them through a filter that didn't quite understand human language. By December 30th it was constant. Every radio operator reported the same thing. Voices beneath the static, not speaking any language we recognised, not speaking at all maybe, but communicating in something that sounded like language, that had rhythm and structure but no meaning we could grasp. We were ordered to log it as atmospheric interference, solar radiation, magnetic field distortion. Anything but what we all knew it was. Something was listening, and occasionally it tried to talk back. The radar echoes started on New Year's Eve. Contacts appearing and vanishing, moving at speeds that made no sense. One moment stationary, the next crossing 50 miles in seconds, then gone completely, leaving no trace on any frequency. The radar operators called them ghosts, false returns, equipment malfunction. But 12 different radar systems don't malfunction in exactly the same way at exactly the same time. I was in the communication centre when the first clear contact came through. January 3rd, 0400 hours by the log, though time meant nothing under the endless sun. Seaman Williams was manning the radar. Young kid from Oklahoma, good with electronics, better at keeping his head down and following orders. Had been watching the ghost contacts for days, logging them dutifully, not asking questions. Then he went very still. "I've got solid contact," he said quietly. Bearing 270. Range 30 miles. Altitude estimate 15,000 feet. Speed. He stopped. Looked at the scope again. Recalculated. Speed estimate 1200 miles per hour. Sir, that last word was barely a whisper, because in 1947 nothing flew at 1200 miles per hour. The fastest jets we had could barely break 600. Whatever Williams was tracking was moving at impossible speeds. Track it, I said. Record everything. The contact held steady for 45 seconds, then it accelerated. Just accelerated, with no period of increasing speed, from 1200 miles per hour to something the radar couldn't track anymore. It was there. Then it was gone, like someone had changed channels on a television. Williams turned to me, face white. What do I log this as, sir? I opened my mouth, closed it, thought about the orders, about the classification stamps, about the careful language we'd been instructed to use. Polar refraction, I said finally. Atmospheric anomaly. He stared at me. Sir, that was solid contact. I tracked it for nearly a minute. That was real. I know, but you're going to log it as polar refraction anyway. And he did. Because those were the orders. Because that's what we all did in those first weeks. We lied in our logs and told ourselves we were following protocol. We didn't realise yet that the protocol was designed specifically to create a documentary trail of lies, something to point to later, something to explain why, when the truth finally came out, nobody would believe it. The contacts continued, multiple times per day, always moving at impossible speeds, always vanishing without trace. By mid-January, the radar operators had stopped being surprised. They just logged them mechanically. Polar refraction, atmospheric interference, magnetic anomaly. We all knew better. But knowing and acknowledging are different things. An acknowledgement required courage that none of us had been trained for. Then came January 17th, and everything changed. January, the first loss. The PBM Martin Mariner lifted off at 0800 hours. Call sign George 1, crew of 3, Captain Thomas Reed, navigator James Walsh, radio operator Michael Chen. Good men, experienced flyers. They'd been doing reconnaissance flights over the Ross Ice Shelf for 2 weeks without incident. The mission was routine, standard mapping run, photographing the coastline, checking ice conditions. Weather was clear, visibility unlimited. Nothing in the briefing suggested danger. I was on the Mount Olympus when it happened, in the communications room monitoring radio traffic, logging the endless stream of position reports and weather updates, and the quiet normalcy of men doing a job they'd done 100 times before. George 1 checked in at 0815. Position nominal, course steady, nothing to report. At 0837, Cheng's voice crackled through the speakers. Mount Olympus, George 1. We have visual contact bearing 090. Distance approximately 2 miles. Altitude matching ours. Unable to identify. Over. The radio operator responded immediately. George 1, describe contact. Over. Static. Long seconds of nothing but white noise. Then Cheng's voice again. Quieter now, uncertain. It's disc-shaped, metallic, moving parallel to our course. No visible propulsion, no wings. Non. He stopped. Sir, it's matching our every movement. Exactly, like it's studying us. The room went silent. Every operator stopped what they were doing. Every man present understood what we were hearing. This wasn't polar refraction. This wasn't atmospheric interference. This was contact. George 1, maintain course and speed. Do not engage. Acknowledge. Over. The response was immediate but different. Reed's voice now, the captain, tense but controlled. Mount Olympus, George 1 acknowledging. But advise. The object is now moving closer. Range 1 mile and closing. Still no visible propulsion. Speed increasing. We are taking evasive action. Over! Then Walsh, the navigator, his voice higher, cracking slightly. It's coming directly at us. Jesus Christ, it's accelerating! We're braking right, full power, but it's matching us. It's right on top of us. It's... The transmission ended, not with static, not with a cut. It just stopped mid-word, as if someone had flipped a switch. One moment, Walsh's terrified voice. The next, perfect silence. George 1, come in. George 1, respond. George 1, this is Mount Olympus. Acknowledge. Over. Nothing. The frequency was dead. No carrier wave, no static. Just the kind of silence that meant there was nothing on the other end anymore. A search flight launched within the hour. They found debris scattered across 6 square miles of ice shelf. The wreckage pattern made no sense. The pieces were too small, too evenly distributed, as if the plane hadn't crashed but had been dismantled in mid-air with surgical precision. They found Chen, alone, somehow alive, sitting in the snow 3 miles from the main debris field, uninjured, conscious, staring at nothing. He didn't speak for 3 days. When he finally did, it was in the medical bay, under armed guard, with Bird himself present. I was there too, taking notes that I knew would never appear in any official report. Chen sat on the edge of the bed, hands folded in his lap, eyes focused on something none of us could see. His voice was flat, mechanical, like he was reading someone else's words. It wasn't hostile, he said. That's what people don't understand. It wasn't attacking us. It was just looking, the way you might look at an insect. Curious, detached, completely without malice or mercy. What happened to Reed and Walsh? Bird asked quietly. Chenk's eyes refocused slightly. Found Bird's face, gone. They took them, not took, dissolved. No, that's not right either. They just stopped being there, like they were edited out of reality. One moment Reed was right beside me, hand, on the controls, shouting something I couldn't hear over the engines. The next moment there was just empty air where he'd been sitting. No blood, no struggle, just absence. He paused, tilted his head like he was listening to something. Then he looked directly at me, and his eyes were completely sane, which somehow made it worse. The light didn't cast shadows, he said. That's how I knew it was on from our world. Light always casts shadows. Always. But this light, it came from the object, this brilliant white light that filled the cabin, and it didn't make a single shadow anywhere. Like it existed in a different physics. Like it was light from some other kind of universe, bleeding through into ours. What did you see inside the light? I asked. Chen smiled. It was the most horrible expression I'd ever seen on a human face. I saw what we look like from outside, from the perspective of something that understands dimensions we can't even perceive. We are so small, so temporary, so absolutely irrelevant to the universe we think we inhabit. He stopped smiling. The light faded, and I was sitting in the snow, and George 1 was scattered across the ice in pieces too small to identify, and Reed and Walsh were gone like they'd never existed at all. Did they say anything? Bird pressed. Did you hear any communication? Chen laughed. High and sharp and wrong. They don't communicate like we do, Admiral. They don't need to. They just know. And now I know too. I know what they're doing down here. I know what they've always been doing. I know why we need to leave. Right now. Before they decide we're not just interesting. Before they decide we're something that needs to be corrected. What are they doing? I asked. Chen looked at me, through me, waiting. That's all. Just waiting. They've been waiting for millions of years, and they're very, very patient. After that, he stopped talking entirely. They evacuated him on the next transport. I heard later that he spent the rest of his life in a psychiatric facility. Never spoke another word. The official report stated that George 1 experienced catastrophic mechanical failure at altitude. The 3 crew members were killed instantly. The wreckage was consistent with mid-air explosion. No external factors were involved. Every single word was a lie, and we all signed off on it anyway. Because what else could we do? Tell the truth. Say that something down here, something that treated the laws of physics like suggestions, had decided to examine one of our aircraft and had accidentally destroyed it in the process. Nobody would believe us. Hell, we barely believed ourselves. But we'd seen the wreckage. We'd heard the radio traffic. We'd listened to Chen describe light that cast no shadows and crew members who simply stopped existing. We knew, and knowing changed everything. February. Bayard breaks. Silence. For 2 weeks after George 1, the fleet operated under unofficial lockdown. No solo flights, no extended range patrols. Everything in groups, everything within visual range of support. The mission objectives quietly shifted from exploration to survival. The radar contacts continued, daily now, sometimes hourly. Objects moving at speeds that made our fastest aircraft look like they were standing still. We stopped logging them as atmospheric interference. We just stopped logging them at all. What do you write in a report when reality itself stops making sense? On February 5th, Byrd called a private briefing. Officers only, no notes, no recordings. Just 30 men in a sealed room on the Mount Olympus, and the Admiral standing at the front looking like he'd aged 20 years in the past month. He didn't waste time with preliminaries. Gentlemen, we are dealing with a force that represents a threat unlike anything humanity has encountered. What we've seen here, what we've documented, what we've lost men to, this changes our understanding of the world, of our place in it. Someone in the back, I never found out who, asked the question we were all thinking. What exactly are they, sir? Byrd's hands were shaking. I remember that detail with perfect clarity. This man who had flown over both poles, who had spent winters alone in the Antarctic, who had faced every extreme of environment and danger that the planet could offer, was standing in front of us with hands that shook like leaves in wind. I don't know, he said finally, but I can tell you what they're capable of. They have aircraft that can fly pole to pole at speeds we cannot match. They have technology that renders our most advanced equipment obsolete. They have been here in Antarctica for longer than we can comprehend, and they have been watching us since we arrived. He paused, drew a breath that sounded like it hurt. In the event of a future war, the enemy could use such aircraft to launch attacks from bases at the poles, flying from pole to pole at speeds that make interception impossible, striking anywhere on Earth with impunity. That's the threat we're facing. That's what I will be reporting to Washington. But we're not facing a future war, another officer said quietly. We're in one now, aren't we? Byrd didn't answer. Didn't need to. We could all feel it. The weight of being observed, the sense that we were insects under glass, being studied by something that viewed us with neither hostility nor compassion, just cold scientific interest. They haven't attacked, Byrd continued. That's crucial to understand. Despite ample opportunity, despite our presence in what appears to be their territory, they have not initiated hostile action. George 1 was an accident, a consequence of close examination, not an intentional act of war. That's supposed to be comforting, someone muttered. No. Byrd's voice was flat. It's supposed to be terrifying, because it means they don't see us as a threat. We're not worth attacking. We're just something curious they found in their backyard. And when they're done studying us, when they've learned everything they want to know, what happens then? Silence. The kind of silence that occurs when every person in a room simultaneously realizes they're powerless. That all their training, all their weapons, all their technological achievement means exactly nothing in the face of what we'd encountered. The operation is being curtailed, Byrd said. We leave in 48 hours. I will be personally briefing the Joint Chiefs in Washington. Everything we've observed will be documented and classified at the highest possible level. Will the truth come out? I asked. Will people know what we found? Byrd looked at me. His eyes were hollow, haunted. No, Lieutenant. People will never know what we found, because if they did, society would collapse overnight. How do you tell humanity that we're not alone, that would have never been alone? that we're being monitored by something so far beyond us that we're barely worth noticing? How do you maintain order when everyone realises we're not the apex species, not the masters of our own world, just tolerated? He turned to address the room. Every man here will sign non-disclosure agreements. Violation will result in court-martial and imprisonment. Your logs will be confiscated, your photographs will be destroyed, your memories will become classified information. As far as the world is concerned, Operation High Jump was a successful training and a mapping mission that returned early due to weather and equipment limitations. And if we talk, someone asked, you won't. Not because you're afraid of punishment, but because you'll realise in time that keeping the secret is an act of mercy. The world isn't ready for this truth. Maybe it never will be. The briefing ended. We filed out in silence. Nobody met anyone else's eyes. We were all thinking the same thing. We'd come to Antarctica as explorers. We were leaving as prisoners. Prisoners of knowledge we couldn't share, couldn't use, could only carry like a weight that would grow heavier with every passing year. 2 days later, Bird gave an interview to a Chilean newspaper, El Mercurio. I have no idea how he managed it, how he slipped past the handlers and the classification orders long enough to speak even one truth into the public record. He told them about the aircraft that could fly pole to pole at incredible speeds. He told them about the threat. He tried, in the only way he could, to warn the world. The article was published on March 5th. By March 7th it had been completely buried, lost in news cycles and political stories, dismissed as tabloid sensationalism. The Admiral's reputation protected him from overt punishment, but his career effectively ended that day. He'd tried to tell the truth. The world chose not to listen. We arrived back in Norfolk on March 9th. 6 months early, 4,700 personnel returning from an expedition that officially found nothing unusual, experienced no contact with anomalous phenomena, lost 3 men to a mechanical accident, and terminated ahead of schedule due to equipment limitations. Every single word was carefully constructed to be technically accurate and completely misleading. We called it the truth, but it was just another name for surrender. March, the black silence after return. The Navy processed us like contaminated material. Separate debriefings, individual interrogations. Each man isolated, questioned, documented, and then dispersed before he could compare notes with anyone else. It was surgical, efficient, designed to fragment any collective memory of what we had experienced. My debriefing lasted 4 days. 3 different intelligence officers, asking the same questions in different orders, looking for inconsistencies, contradictions, any sign that I might talk about what he'd seen. I gave them nothing, not because I was brave, because I was terrified. On the 3rd day, a civilian showed up. No name, no credentials, just a quiet man in a grey suit who sat across from me and smiled without warmth. You understand what happens if you discuss Operation High Jump, he said. Not asked, stated, as fact. I understand. Do you? He leaned forward. Court-martial is the official consequence, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about disappearing, about becoming the kind of person who simply stops existing in any official capacity. No military record, no service history, no pension, no documentation that you were ever in Antarctica at all. He paused, studied me. And if you do stay silent, if you follow orders like a good soldier, then you get a nice desk job somewhere quiet. Maybe a promotion, maybe a comfortable retirement. Your choice. I chose survival. We all did. 2 weeks after my debriefing, my clearance was revoked. All of it. Every classification level us had held. Gone. I was reassigned to supply logistics at a base in Nebraska. As far from intelligence work, as far from anything that mattered as the Navy could send me. I wasn't alone. Every junior officer from Task Force 68 received similar treatment. Reassignment. Demotion by way of irrelevance. Shuffled to positions where we'd never have access to classified information again, where we'd never be in a position to speak with authority about what we'd witnessed. The senior officers fared worse. Commander Hawkins, the cartographer who'd first noticed the impossible coastlines, retired within 3 months. Medical discharge, stress-related illness. He moved to Montana and became a surveyor, never spoke about Antarctica again. I heard he burned all his maps from the expedition. Lieutenant Morrison, who'd found the logbook at Little America, took up civilian sailing. He was lost at sea in 1949 during what was officially ruled a boating accident in calm weather. His body was never recovered. Captain Andrews, who'd commanded one of the destroyers and witnessed multiple radar contacts, suffered a breakdown in 1950, spent 6 months in a psychiatric facility. When he got out, he'd stopped talking about what happened, stopped talking about much of anything. He died in 1953, gunshot wound, ruled suicide. 3 men from the mapping team disappeared entirely. Not died, disappeared. Left the Navy with honourable discharges and then just vanished from record. No employment history, no tax returns, no death certificates. Like they'd been erased from reality as thoroughly as Reed and Walsh had been erased from George I. I tried to find them in 1958. Spent weeks tracking down addresses, following paper trails, making quiet inquiries. Found nothing. It was like they'd never existed. And maybe in some official sense they hadn't. Maybe silence wasn't enough. Maybe some truths are so dangerous that the only solution is to eliminate everyone who knows them. The press coverage was the final insult. There wasn't any. Oh, there were a few articles, brief mentions of the task force's return, paragraph-long summaries that emphasised the training aspects, the successful equipment testing, the valuable mapping data collected. Nothing about early termination, nothing about casualties, nothing about anything that had actually happened. The El Mercurio interview with Byrd vanished from most archives. I found one copy in 1962 buried in a university library that was slated for demolition. I made photocopies, hid them, just in case. Operation High Jump became a footnote, a minor military exercise, something historians barely mention, the largest Antarctic expedition in history, and it disappeared from public consciousness like it had never happened at all. That's how you hide the truth, not with dramatic cover-ups and conspiracy theories, with bureaucracy, with boring reports and classified documents, and the steady, relentless machinery of institutional forgetting. By 1950, if you asked anyone about Operation High Jump, they'd look at you blankly. By 1960, the name itself was barely remembered. By 1970, it might as well have never occurred, except in the minds of those of us who'd been there, who carried the weight of it every day, who woke up at night thinking about light that cast no shadows and objects that moved at impossible speeds, and the certain knowledge that we were not alone, had never been alone, would never be alone again. The silence was absolute, and it was enforced with the efficiency that suggested long practice. Like this wasn't the first time something had been buried. Like the machinery for hiding inconvenient truths had been built decades ago and oiled regularly since. I started to wonder, what else had been hidden? What other expeditions, what other encounters, what other moments of contact had been systematically erased from record? How long had they known? But those were dangerous questions, the kind that got you reassigned, or disappeared, or worse. So I kept my head down, did my job, counted inventory in Nebraska and tried to forget what I'd seen. Tried to convince myself that maybe it had all been some kind of mass delusion. Stress and isolation and the endless Antarctic day playing tricks on an entire task force. Then 1957 came, and everything made terrible, perfect sense. The thing that haunts the timeline International Geophysical Year, 1957 to 1958, announced as a massive scientific collaboration, 67 countries working together to study the Earth. Meteorology, oceanography, solar activity, and Antarctica, especially Antarctica. 12 nations established research bases, Scientific teams from around the world suddenly flooding into a continent that had been virtually abandoned since Operation High Jump's early termination, coordinated, organised, as if they'd all received the same memo at the same time. Study the continent, map it thoroughly, establish permanent presence, but above all, make sure no one goes there unsupervised. I was in Nebraska when the IGY launched, still counting boots and ration packs, but I watched the news with a growing sense of recognition. This wasn't random scientific interest. This was coordinated response. This was containment. Then came December 1st, 1959. The Antarctic Treaty was open for signature. The treaty was unprecedented, still is. 12 nations, many of them rivals, some of them enemies, all agreeing to a set of principles that effectively locked down an entire continent. No military activity, no nuclear testing, no mineral mining, no territorial claims, complete freedom of scientific investigation, but only for approved research, complete oversight of all activities, complete international cooperation. It was ratified in 1961, in the middle of the Cold War, with the Soviet Union and the United States on the verge of nuclear conflict, at a time when they couldn't agree on anything, except Antarctica. Think about that. Really think about it. Two superpowers who can't cooperate on anything, who are locked in an existential struggle for global dominance, who are building enough nuclear weapons to destroy civilization, and they both immediately agree to make Antarctica neutral territory. Forever. No exceptions. Why? The official explanation is noble. Preservation of the environment, international scientific cooperation, preventing militarization of the last pristine wilderness. Beautiful lies. The truth is simpler and more terrifying. Both sides encountered the same thing we did. Both sides realized the same truth, and both sides understood that the only way to manage that truth was to ensure that nobody ever went to Antarctica except under strict supervision. That no rogue nation, no independent expedition, no curious civilian could stumble across what was waiting down there. The treaty wasn't about preservation. It was about containment, about controlling access, about making absolutely certain that contact, when it occurred, would be managed by people who knew what they were dealing with. Look at the provisions. Freedom of scientific investigation, yes, but only approved research, inspection rights for all stations, advance notification of all expeditions, complete accountability for everyone who enters the continent. You cannot just go to Antarctica. You cannot charter a plane and fly there. You cannot buy land. You can't establish a private base. Every single person who enters that continent does so with the knowledge and approval of their government. Every movement is tracked. Every discovery is monitored. The treaty has been in effect for over 60 years now, through the Cold War, through détente, through new global conflicts and changing alliances, and it has never been violated, not once, not by any signatory nation. That is not just successful diplomacy, that's fear. That is every major government on Earth agreeing that whatever is in Antarctica, whatever we found, is more important than territorial ambition, more important than resource extraction, more important than national sovereignty. They know. All of them. Every nation that signed the treaty knows what's down there, or knows enough to understand that letting people go unsupervised is too dangerous to allow. I realised this in 1962, sitting in my house in Nebraska, reading about the treaty, watching the news coverage of this miraculous international cooperation, and suddenly understanding that Operation High Jump hadn't been an isolated incident. It had been the catalyst, the moment that forced every major government to acknowledge a truth they'd probably suspected for decades. We're not alone. We share this planet with something else, something older, something more advanced, something that has been watching us, studying us, waiting beneath the ice for reasons we can't begin to comprehend. And the only thing we can do is make sure that contact, when it happens, occurs on terms we can control, or at least monitor. That's the real purpose of the treaty. That's why it has never been violated. That's why Antarctica remains the most regulated place on Earth. Because everyone in power understands what we learned in 1947, that we're not the apex species, that our technology, our weapons, our entire civilization is built on the assumption that we're alone and advanced, and that assumption is wrong. The treaty isn't protecting Antarctica from us. It's protecting us from what's in Antarctica, from the truth, from contact with something we're not ready to comprehend. I spent years thinking about this, watching the news, following scientific reports, tracking expeditions. Every piece of information confirmed what I already knew, that the treaty was working exactly as intended, that Antarctica was being successfully quarantined, that the secret was holding, but secrets don't last forever. Eventually someone talks, someone leaks, someone decides that the truth is more important than the comfortable lie. Admiral Byrd tried. He gave that interview. He spoke about aircraft that could fly pole to pole. He tried to warn people. And he was silenced. Not dramatically, not with violence, just with bureaucracy and reputation management and the careful machinery of institutional forgetting. Chen tried. He told us what he saw, about light that casts no shadows, about crew members edited out of reality, about things waiting in the ice with patience measured in geological time, and he was locked away where nobody would hear him, where his testimony could be dismissed as trauma-induced delusion. Others tried and disappeared, or died, or simply stopped trying, and I've been silent for decades, carrying this knowledge like a burden, writing it down in fragments, hiding pages, waiting for the right moment, or the courage, or just the certainty that telling the truth matters more than personal survival. Maybe that moment is now. Maybe it was always now. Maybe the only thing that matters is that someone, somewhere, has a complete record of what happened, what we found, why we never went back. Because Hera's what haunts me, what keeps me awake at night even decades later. It's not that they're there. It's not that they've been there, waiting, watching, for longer than human civilization has existed. It's that we were the ones who showed up early. Final Addendum. Handwritten. 1971. The following was written in the margin of the original field log, dated March 1971. The handwriting is shaky, rushed, like someone writing under time pressure. This was the last entry made before the author disappeared from all public records. No death certificate, no burial, no obituary, just absence. I'm 73 years old now, old enough that the threats don't matter anymore. What are they going to do? Imprison an old man who won't live long enough to see trial? Disappear someone who's already disappearing day by day into the fog of age and irrelevance? So I'm writing this. Final testament, last truth, whatever you want to call it. They didn't warn us to stay out of Antarctica forever. That's what everyone assumes. That the treaty, the secrecy, the careful control is about keeping us away from them. Protecting us from contact we're not ready for, but that's backwards. That's completely, terrifyingly backwards. I figured it out in '68. Reading a scientific paper about ice core samples, dating the layers, mapping the history of Antarctic glaciation, and there it was, buried in the data like a bomb waiting to be noticed. The ice is getting thinner, not from climate change. This started long before that. This is a cycle, natural, inevitable. The ice has been thick for thousands of years, but it's thinning, gradually, steadily, and eventually, within our lifetimes probably, it will be thin enough for what's underneath to emerge. That's what Chen meant. That's what he understood when they took him. They're not staying in Antarctica by choice. They're not hiding. They're waiting, not for permission, not for contact, for the ice to thin, for the time to come, for whatever schedule they're following, whatever plan they made millions of years ago when they first arrived or first awakened or first decided that this frozen continent would serve their purposes. The treaty isn't keeping us out. It's keeping everyone monitored, making sure that when they emerge, When the ice is finally thin enough, when whatever they've been waiting for finally happens, the governments know about it immediately, have time to prepare, or flee, or surrender. We weren't supposed to find them in 47. We arrived too early, before they were ready, before whatever is supposed to happen. And they let us go, not because they were merciful, but because we were irrelevant, a minor inconvenience in a schedule measured in geological epochs. But the schedule is accelerating now. The ice cores prove it. The melting is faster, the emergence is closer. And I think that's why I'm writing this. Because someone needs to know. Someone needs to understand that all our preparation, all our monitoring, all our careful control might not matter at all. Because they're not the threat. The threat is what happens when they're ready, when they decide it's time, when the ice is thin enough and whatever they've been waiting for finally arrives. That's what haunts me. What's haunted me since 47. Not that they exist, not that they're advanced beyond our comprehension, but that they're waiting for something. And we have no idea what. Maybe it's invasion, maybe it's harvesting, maybe it's transformation, maybe it's something we don't even have words for, something that requires concepts we haven't evolved to understand. But it's coming. It's been coming for millions of years, and we arrived early, saw the preparation, witnessed the waiting, and were sent home with orders to never speak of it. Well, I'm speaking now. I'm old. I'm dying. I'm beyond their reach. And I need someone to know, someone to understand, someone to be ready, if ready is even possible. They didn't warn us to stay out of Antarctica forever. They warned us not to arrive early. And now, decades later, I understand what that means. It means there's a schedule, a timetable, an appointed hour when something will happen. When whatever has been sleeping or waiting or preparing beneath the ice will finally act. And when that hour comes, all our technology, all our weapons, all our treaties and preparations will mean exactly nothing. Because we'll be facing something that has been planning this moment since before human beings learned to make fire. So watch Antarctica. Watch the ice thickness measurements. Watch the scientific reports. Watch for the moment when routine research suddenly stops, when access is cut off even more strictly than before, when governments start moving military assets south for reasons they won't explain. That will be the sign. That will be the moment when they're ready, when the ice is thin enough, when whatever they've been waiting for finally arrives, and then we'll learn what Operation High Jump really discovered, not what was down there, but what's been coming all along. This is my final entry, my last truth. I'm hiding copies of this log in places I hope will survive whatever comes next. Maybe someone will find them. Maybe someone will understand. Maybe someone will be ready when the ice finally thins enough. Or maybe none of it matters. Maybe we were always just temporary tenants on a planet that belongs to something else. Something that was here first. Something that will be here long after we're gone. But at least someone will know the truth. At least this record will exist. At least the lie will be documented alongside the reality. Watch the ice. Watch Antarctica. Watch for what's coming. We weren't meant to find them in 47. But soon, very soon, they'll make sure we can't miss them. Final entry, March 1971. The author of this log disappeared 3 days after writing this addendum. Nobody was found. No explanation was given. The official record states that he died of natural causes, but no death certificate was ever filed. This document was recovered from a safety deposit box in Washington in 2010. It had been sealed since 1971. The Antarctic Treaty remains in force. Access to the continent is still strictly controlled, and the ice continues to thin. They moved with efficient, brutal precision that spoke of years of practice and unlimited resources. Men in dark tactical gear emblazoned with HSI, Homeland Security Investigations, flooded her apartment like a coordinated invasion force. They carried electronic jammers that immediately killed her internet connection and cell phone signal, ensuring that no evidence of the raid could be transmitted to the outside world. Mara didn't resist. She couldn't. The revelation of her own name in the exercise documents had shattered something fundamental in her understanding of reality. She sat frozen in her chair as they systematically dismantled her entire investigation, bagging computers, hard drives, printed documents, and the original VHS tape that had started everything. Mara Ellison, the team leader announced, his voice carrying the flat, bureaucratic authority of someone who had recited these words many times before. You are being detained under the Espionage Act and the provisions of the Patriot Act for the unauthorized access of classified material and conspiracy to aid terrorist entities in their ongoing operations against the United States. The charges were absurd, but Mara understood that absurdity was the point. In the post-9/11 legal framework, the government's definition of terrorism had expanded to include almost any activity that challenged official narratives. Her research, her questions, her very curiosity had been redefined as acts of treason. As they led her out in handcuffs, past the terrified faces of neighbours who would remember her as the woman who had turned out to be a spy, Mara caught a glimpse of someone watching from across the street. It was Kellerman, the man from the cafe, observing her arrest with the detached professionalism of someone monitoring a completed operation. Their eyes met for a brief moment and he nodded slightly, not in greeting or sympathy, but in acknowledgement, a confirmation that everything had proceeded according to plan. The government's case against her was presented in a sealed FISA court, where neither the evidence nor the proceedings were accessible to public scrutiny. They had documentation of her accessing classified servers, recordings of her encrypted communications with foreign assets like at Radar Ghost, and her own research notes that they characterized as intelligence gathering for hostile entities. They presented her investigation not as the work of a concerned citizen or independent researcher, but as a sophisticated espionage operation designed to undermine public confidence in government institutions and aid terrorist recruitment. Every question she had asked was reframed as an attack on national security. Every fact she had uncovered was presented as intelligence that could be used against American interests. The judge, operating under national security guidelines that prioritise state secrets over due process, sentenced her to indefinite detention in ADX Florence, the federal supermax facility designed to make dangerous criminals disappear from the world. She was classified as a Level 6 terrorist, a designation that eliminated most constitutional protections and ensured that she would spend the rest of her life in solitary confinement. But something unexpected happened in the weeks following her arrest. Fragments of her research began appearing online, leaked to conspiracy theory websites and alternative media platforms in carefully edited chunks. Anonymous accounts uploaded her audio analysis comparing the ATC recordings, her financial charts tracking the put options, and scanned pages from Dr. Thorne's suppressed paper. The leaks were incomplete and disconnected, presenting tantalizing glimpses of a larger truth without providing the comprehensive narrative that Mara had spent months constructing. Each fragment raised more questions than it answered, creating a puzzle that thousands of amateur researchers began trying to solve. The story spread through the conspiracy theory ecosystem with viral intensity. Mara Ellison became a martyred truth-teller, a patriotic whistleblower who had been silenced by a tyrannical government for asking inconvenient questions. Her name appeared on protest signs and bumper stickers. Her fragmented research became the foundational text of a new generation of 9/11 truth-seekers who built elaborate theories around the gaps in her evidence. Online forums dedicated to her case attracted hundreds of thousands of members who spent countless hours analysing every leaked document, enhancing every audio file, and connecting dots that may or may not have been related. The movement consumed enormous amounts of time and energy from people who might otherwise have been investigating more immediate and actionable forms of government corruption. In her solitary cell, staring at concrete walls that never varied, Mara had years to think about what had really happened to her. She had access to limited reading materials, carefully selected books and magazines that were screened for security risks, but no internet, no phone calls, and no contact with the outside world except for monthly visits from a government-appointed psychiatrist who documented her mental state for official records. During those long, empty hours, she began to understand the true sophistication of the operation she had been part of. The evidence she had uncovered was real. The financial anomalies, the radar substitutions, the media manipulation had all been genuine. But her discovery of them hadn't been accidental. She had been led to each revelation by a carefully constructed trail that had made her feel like an independent investigator while actually being a participant in a psychological experiment. The goal wasn't to suppress inconvenient truths about September 11th. It was to manage them, to ensure that people who asked dangerous questions were given satisfying, but ultimately harmless answers that would occupy their attention without threatening the real power structures that had profited from the attacks. Her research had been allowed to develop just far enough to create compelling conspiracy theories, but not far enough to identify the specific individuals and institutions that were actually responsible. She had mapped the edges of the conspiracy while being carefully steered away from its centre. The 9/11 truth movement that had grown around her, leaked research was exactly what the system needed. A large, vocal, but ultimately marginalised group that absorbed dissent and channeled it into harmless activities like conference presentations, documentary films and internet discussions. The conspiracy theorists served as controlled opposition, providing an outlet for skepticism while ensuring that genuine investigation was drowned in a sea of speculation and theory. But perhaps most insidiously, her case had established a precedent for the treatment of future researchers. Anyone who began asking serious questions about government actions would be confronted with the example of Mara Ellison, the translator who had thought she was uncovering truth, but had actually been playing a role in an elaborate deception, and who had ended up spending her life in prison for crimes she didn't understand she was committing. The message was clear. The cost of curiosity was too high, the risk of investigation was too great, and the line between research and treason was too thin for ordinary citizens to navigate safely. Years passed in the unchanging routine of maximum security imprisonment. Mara aged in her cell, her dark hair going grey, her body adapting to the constraints of a space designed to contain rather than rehabilitate. She developed the 1,000-yard stare common to long-term solitary confinement, a psychological adjustment to environmental deprivation that allowed consciousness to survive even when hope had been systematically eliminated. But her mind remained sharp and she continued to think about the implications of her experience. If her investigation had been managed from the beginning, if her discoveries had been strategically placed for her to find, then how many other conspiracy theories were actually psychological operations designed to misdirect public attention? How many whistleblowers had been selected and groomed for their role? How many leaked documents were authentic information released in carefully controlled ways to create the illusion of transparency while actually deepening the confusion? How many truth seekers were unwittingly serving the interests of the very systems they believed they were opposing? The questions haunted her, but they also provided a strange form of comfort. Even in prison, even stripped of freedom and identity, she was still thinking, still analysing, still trying to understand the shape of the cage that had been built around human consciousness. In her 10th year of imprisonment, Mara received an unexpected visitor. The guard who escorted her to the visitation room was apologetic. Visits were rare, and this one hadn't been scheduled through normal channels. The visitor was a young woman, perhaps 25, with the intense focus and slightly manic energy that Mara recognised in herself from decades earlier. "Ms. Ellison," the woman said, speaking quickly as if afraid their time would be cut short. "My name is Rebecca Torres. I'm a documentary filmmaker. I've been researching your case for the past 3 years, and I think I've found something important. Something about Building 7 that nobody has ever." Mara held up her hand, stopping the young woman mid-sentence. Through the reinforced glass that separated them, she looked into Rebecca's eager, determined face, and saw herself at the beginning of a journey that could only end in this same room on the other side of the same glass. "Ms. Torres," Mara said quietly, her voice rough from years of disuse, "let me ask you something. How did you first learn about my case? What was the first piece of evidence that made you think there was a story worth investigating?" Rebecca's enthusiasm was undimmed. "It was a video file that was posted anonymously to a secure drop site, footage of Building 7 that I'd never seen before, with audio that hadn't been available in any of the official archives. The timing discrepancies were obvious once you knew what to look for." Mara closed her eyes and leaned back in her chair. Another tape, another anomaly, another researcher being led down a carefully prepared path that would feel like discovery, while actually being manipulation. "Ms. Torres," she said, opening her eyes and looking directly at the young filmmaker, "I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you, and then I need you to walk out of here, delete whatever research you've done, and never think about any of this again." But even as she spoke, Mara knew it was hopeless. Rebecca Torres had the same look in her eyes that Mara had once seen in her own mirror, the absolute certainty that she was on the verge of uncovering a truth that would change everything. The same conviction that had led Mara to spend 20 years in a cage built from her own curiosity. The cycle would continue. New researchers would be recruited, new evidence would be strategically placed, new truth seekers would be transformed into unwitting participants in their own imprisonment. The conspiracy wasn't just about what had happened on September 11th. It was about what happened to anyone who tried to look too closely at power, who asked too many questions, who believed that truth was something that could be found rather than something that was manufactured. As the guard led her back to her cell, Mara realised that she had finally understood the true scope of the operation she'd been part of. It wasn't a conspiracy to hide a single crime. It was a system for managing reality itself, for ensuring that the truth would always be whatever those in power needed it to be. The smoke behind the towers wasn't just the debris of a single day's deception. It was the fog of war in a conflict that most people didn't even know was being fought. A war against the very possibility of independent thought, waged with weapons of information and cages built from curiosity itself. And in that war, every truth seeker was both a casualty and a weapon, both a victim and an unwitting soldier, in an army that was fighting against its own cause. The tape that shouldn't exist had led her exactly where it was supposed to lead her, into a truth that was indistinguishable from a lie, a cage that was built from the very evidence that had seemed to promise freedom. In the end, Mara Ellison had found exactly what she was looking for, and that, perhaps, was the most terrifying revelation of all. The smoke behind the towers, an extended investigation. What if the single most defining event of the 21st century wasn't what we were told? We've all seen the footage, heard the official story, and lived with the consequences. But what happens when a single piece of evidence lost in the system for over 2 decades falls into the hands of the one person with the skills and obsession to see the cracks in the narrative? This is not a story about easy answers. It's a story about the questions that can unravel a reality. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed to Sleep Theories and hit the notification bell. We dive deep into the world's greatest mysteries, and what you're about to read will have you questioning everything. In the comments below, let us know. After learning about the inconsistencies, what's the one piece of the 9/11 puzzle that never sat right with you? Now settle in. This is the smoke behind the towers. The dust in Mara Ellison's apartment was a library of dead projects. It settled on the spines of German legal dictionaries, coated the cooling fins of her overworked computer, and formed a fine grey film on the stacked plastic boxes of government transcripts that were her livelihood. The apartment itself was a testament to organised chaos. Cables snaking between translation equipment, multiple keyboards in different alphabets, and towers of reference materials that threatened to topple with each vibration from the subway below. Mara was a freelance translator, a ghost in the machine of bureaucracy, hired for her fluency in 5 languages and her singular, obsessive attention to detail. She didn't just translate words, she translated context, subtext, and the terrifying silence between official lines. Her clients range from immigration lawyers needing farcy depositions, translated to federal agencies requiring real-time interpretation of intercepted communications. It was solitary work that suited her temperament. She'd always been more comfortable with the precision of language than the chaos of human interaction. The package from the Department of Defense's Archival Division was standard. A reinforced cardboard box, a chain of custody form clipped to the top, and inside 12 VHS tapes labelled with alphanumeric codes denoting a declassified batch of field communications from the early 2000s. The accompanying documentation was sparse. A single-page memo requesting translation of any foreign language chatter captured in the background. The pay was modest but steady, and Mara had developed a reputation for catching linguistic details that others missed. Her workspace was a shrine to analogue precision. The professional-grade VCR, a Sony model worth more than most people's cars, sat connected to a digital audio interface that allowed her to isolate frequency ranges and enhance muffled conversations. Multiple monitors displayed waveform analysis software alongside translation databases. She worked methodically, her headphones sealing her in a world of static, fragmented Farsi, Arabic phrases, and the ambient hum of old magnetic tape. The first 11 tapes were unremarkable. Routine military communications, helicopter pilots discussing weather conditions, occasional snippets of foreign languages that were either too corrupted to translate or turned out to be harmless civilian chatter picked up by sensitive equipment. She documented everything with academic precision, noting timestamps, speaker identifications, and confidence levels for her translations. Tape 7 was different from the moment she picked it up. Its label, DOD-AFC-0, 91101-BROLL-4, was slightly smudged, the ink appearing fresher than the others despite the identical date stamps. The B-roll designation caught her attention, typically used for supplementary footage, background material that never made it to air. September 11th, 2001 was faded but legible in the corner, written in what looked like different handwriting than the official labels. She slotted it into the VCR with the reverence of an archaeologist handling a fragile artifact, and pressed play. The screen fizzed to life with a chaotic, familiar horror of that morning. But this wasn't the sanitized, repeatedly broadcast footage that had been burned into collective memory. This was raw, unprocessed, shot from what appeared to be a news helicopter hovering at an angle she'd never seen before. The North Tower bled a furious black plume into a perfect blue sky, but the colours were wrong. They were too vivid, too saturated, as if the horror had been amplified by the unfiltered lens. Her trained eye, honed by years of spotting inconsistencies in testimony and documentation, caught it immediately. In the lower third of the frame, a timecode burned into the tape read 08:42:17 Eastern Standard Time. She knew the official timeline by heart. American Airlines. Flight 11 had struck the North Tower at 8:46 a.m., a 4-minute discrepancy. A chill, small and precise, traced a path down her spine. Technical errors were common in archival footage, she rationalised. Equipment malfunctions, camera operators forgetting to sync their timestamps. She'd seen it hundreds of times in legal depositions where security cameras showed impossible timelines. But as she continued watching, the discrepancy held. The timecode advanced in perfect synchronization with real time, never jumping or resetting. This wasn't a technical glitch. It was consistent, deliberate, accurate. And if it was accurate, then everything she knew about that morning was built on a foundation of sand. Then she heard the voices. They were not the panicked cries of civilians or the frantic dispatches of news anchors that had filled the airwaves. These voices were cool, professional, crackling with the distinct compression of military-grade communication systems. They were barely audible under the rotor wash and wind noise, but her equipment could isolate and enhance them. "Command, this is Skywatch. Confirmed scenario is live. Repeat, is this Vigilant Guardian live or real world?" The voice was young, male, with the clipped precision of military training but an undertone of confusion that made Mara's pulse quicken. A pause, filled with the sound of roaring fire and distant sirens. When the response came, it was from a different voice, older, calmer, carrying the authority of rank. "Maintain exercise protocol. All units. This is a live fly exercise. Treat all tracks as simulated until otherwise notified. The first voice came back, strain creeping in. Skywatch copies. Maintaining protocol. Jesus, that's a lot of smoke for a simulation. Another voice joined the channel, different again, with a slight accent she couldn't immediately place. Command. Falcon 2 requesting permission to vector intercept on the southern track. We show multiple bogies, but exercise parameters did not account for this density. Negative Falcon 2. Maintain exercise posture. All tracks are part of the scenario until command confirms otherwise. Mara's breath caught in her throat. Vigilant Guardian. The name meant nothing to her, but the context was unmistakable. They were talking about an exercise, a drill, at the exact moment when the real attack was unfolding. The confusion in their voices was genuine. They couldn't tell what was real and what was simulation. She rewound the tape, listening again with professional focus. The voices were too clear to be atmospheric noise, too organised to be random civilian communications. This was operational military chatter, recorded at the highest levels of the response hierarchy. And according to the time code, it was happening before the official narrative said the first plane had even hit. The camera panned, and she saw the South Tower in the background, pristine and untouched. According to every official record, every news report, every commission finding, the South Tower would remain undamaged for another 17 minutes. But these military voices were already talking about multiple targets, exercise protocols, and maintaining simulation status. The official story was a solid wall, a monument of accepted fact constructed from thousands of testimonies, investigations and reports. But this tape was a hairline fracture in the granite. It was a glimpse of the scaffolding behind the monument, the framework that held up the official truth. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. The rational part of her mind insisted this was a mislabeled tape, a bureaucratic error. Her contract was explicit about mishandled materials. They were to be reported immediately, returned to the appropriate authorities for proper classification review. But curiosity, that quiet, relentless engine that had driven her through graduate school and into a career built on uncovering meaning in chaos, overrode the fear. She didn't eject the tape. Instead, she connected it to her digital capture system and began making a perfect copy, frame by frame, preserving every pixel and every audio sample. The chill in her spine had become a frozen river, carrying with it the terrible realization that she was holding something that could unravel everything. This tape shouldn't exist, and she knew, with the terrifying certainty of someone who has spent a lifetime connecting dots that others refused to see, that she could never unsee what was on it. As the tape played on, she began taking meticulous notes, documenting call signs, voice patterns, and radio procedures. The military communications continued throughout the footage, painting a picture of an operation that was simultaneously a drill and a real-world crisis, a Schrödinger's catastrophe where reality and simulation existed in quantum superposition, until someone with the authority to collapse the wave function decided what was real. That someone, she was beginning to suspect, was not who the world thought it was. Sleep didn't come. The images played on the backs of her eyelids in an endless loop. The impossibly blue sky, the black smoke billowing against it, the time code burning like a digital scar across her vision. The voices echoed in her memory, their professional calm masking confusion that ran deeper than anyone had ever admitted publicly. By 5 a.m, she was at her desk, the glow of her monitors the only light in the pre-dawn gloom of her apartment. The city outside was beginning its daily resurrection, but Mara existed in a different timeline now, one where the morning of September 11th, 2001 was not history, but an active investigation. Her first stop was the public archive of the 9/11 Commission, a digital tomb containing thousands of pages of testimony, exhibits, and evidence. She had accessed these files before for various translation projects, but now she approached them with the focus of a detective rather than a linguist. The official transcripts were sanitized, edited for clarity and context, with extensive redactions that created black holes in the narrative where sensitive information had been surgically removed. but buried deep in a subsidiary server, linked through footnotes and cross-references that most casual researchers would never follow, she found the motherlode. Raw audio files from air traffic control centres. These were the unedited feeds from Boston Center, New York Terminal Radar Approach Control and Cleveland Center, the front lines of confusion that morning. She put on her professional headphones, the world fading away as she prepared to immerse herself in the chaos. The audio quality was poor, compressed through multiple digital transfers over 2 decades, but her equipment could clean it up. She opened her spectrum analysis software and began the painstaking process of isolating individual voices from the cacophony. The first recordings were exactly what she expected. Controllers struggling to understand what was happening to American Airlines Flight 11. The standard protocols were breaking down in real time as they tried to re-establish contact with a plane that was no longer responding to their calls. American 11, Boston Center, are you there? The controller's voice was professional but edged with the first hints of concern. Static filled the channel. American 11, Boston Center, please respond. More urgent now, the procedural calm beginning to crack. Then a new voice entered the channel, higher pitched, laced with confusion. Boston Center, this is New York approach. We're showing a primary target, fast mover, not squawking transponder. Is this part of the Nordo drill? Nordo, no radio communications. Mara's blood turned to ice water. The Boston controller's response was immediate and sharp. What drill? I don't have anything about a drill on the roster today. What's your location on that primary? Another voice cut in. Different frequency, probably a pilot monitoring emergency channels. Center, this is Delta 243 Heavy. We're hearing some strange chatter on guard frequency. Are we exercising today? Our dispatcher didn't mention anything. Delta 243, stand by. We're trying to sort out some communication issues with one of our aircraft. But the pilot pressed. Center, serious question. We're showing traffic on our TCAS that doesn't correlate with what you're calling out. Our system is painting targets where you're not showing anything. Is this part of some kind of exercise? The timestamp on this exchange was 8:43 a.m., 3 minutes before the official time of impact. The confusion wasn't happening after the attack. It was the environment in which the attack was unfolding. The system was already compromised, already uncertain about what was real and what was simulation. Mara spent the next 16 hours obsessively comparing this raw audio to the sanitized news footage from that morning, using professional editing software to align timelines with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. She created a split-screen comparison, audio waveforms on one side, video timestamps on the other, and she found them, the edits. In the raw ATC tape, a controller could be heard screaming, "He's descending fast, passing 9,000 rate of descent. Jesus Christ, what the hell is he?" The audio cut out completely for exactly 0.2 of a second. A perfect digital slice that could only have been made in post-production. When it resumed, a different controller was speaking in measured professional tones. "We have an aircraft emergency, requesting immediate vectors for emergency descent." The panic had been surgically removed, replaced with standard phraseology that suggested control rather than chaos. She found 17 such edits in the first hour of ATC audio alone. Each one removed confusion, uncertainty, or references to exercises and drills. The real-time breakdown of the air traffic control system had been edited into a narrative of professionals responding to an unprecedented but comprehensible crisis. But the video footage revealed even more sophisticated manipulation. She had obtained raw news helicopter footage from multiple sources, some from official archives, others from amateur collectors who had recorded the live broadcasts. Frame-stepping through a raw feed uploaded by a news photographer years later, she discovered something that made her hands shake. The famous shot of the second impact, broadcast live to millions, showed the plane entering the frame and striking the South Tower in one continuous motion. But in the unedited raw footage, there was a discontinuity. 3 frames before the impact, the camera jerked violently downward, as if the operator had been startled or knocked off balance, showing the streets below for exactly 1/8 of a second before cutting back to the tower, just in time to capture the fireball. It was a blink and you miss it edit, but once she saw it, she couldn't unsee it. The live broadcast had been edited in real time, with a buffer delay that allowed editors to remove the moment of human shock and replace it with a perfect, unobstructed view of the impact. The audience of one in her dusty apartment was now facing a terrifying possibility. The news wasn't just reporting the event, it was curating it in real time, managing the narrative as it unfolded, ensuring that the world saw exactly what someone wanted them to see. The difference between what happened and what was broadcast might be measured in fractions of seconds, but those fractions contained entire universes of meaning. She pulled up the official timeline, cross-referencing it with her growing database of anomalies. The pattern was clear. Every moment of confusion, every instance where the official response system revealed its underlying chaos, had been carefully edited out of the historical record. What remained was a streamlined narrative of surprise, response and tragedy, clean enough to build policy on, coherent enough to justify the reshaping of an entire civilization. But the real story was in the gaps, in the deleted seconds where the facade slipped and revealed the machinery underneath. The tape she had found wasn't just evidence of poor timekeeping or sloppy journalism. It was proof that someone had been editing history in real time, sculpting reality as it unfolded, ensuring that the official story would be the only story that survived. The question that now consumed her was simple and terrible. If they were editing the news as it happened, what else were they controlling? The digital rabbit hole led her inevitably to the physical world. Knowledge had a weight, she realised, and after 3 days of staring at screens, she needed to feel the heft of actual books, the texture of paper that had existed before the internet had made all information suspect. The New York Public Library's Science, Industry and Business Library was a temple to pre-digital knowledge, its research floors filled with bound periodicals and technical journals that predated the homogenization of online information. She took the subway through the early morning darkness, hyper-aware of every face, every reflection in the train windows, the paranoia now a constant background hum in her consciousness. She requested archived journals from the American Society of Civil Engineers, Structural Engineering International, and the Journal of Constructional Steel Research, focusing on publications from late 2001 through 2003. The librarian, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who seemed to exist in permanent twilight, led her to a research carrel buried deep in the stacks. The official reports were unequivocal and had been cited thousands of times. The intense jet fuel fires had softened the steel structural members, causing thermal expansion that pushed the floor joists off their supports. The floors pancaked down onto each other in a progressive collapse that accelerated due to the increasing mass and momentum. It was tragic but straightforward physics. Fire weakens steel, gravity does the rest. But in the months immediately following the attacks, before the official narrative had crystallized and academic careers had been threatened, a different conversation was happening in the margins of professional literature. She found letters to the editor, brief technical notes, and transcripts from early conferences where structural engineers voiced quiet, professional skepticism. One article, published in a now-defunct journal called Structural Integrity Review, bore the innocuous title, Anomalies in the WTC Collapse Dynamics, a Preliminary Analysis. The author was Dr. Aris Thorne, a professor of structural engineering at Northwestern University with 40 years of experience in high-rise design and failure analysis. Dr. Thorne's analysis was methodical and damning. Using basic principles of physics and publicly available measurements, he demonstrated that the towers had fallen through the path of greatest resistance, the undamaged lower floors and the intact core columns at virtually free-fall speed. For that to happen, he argued, the structural resistance had to have been removed almost entirely and almost simultaneously. The observed collapse is consistent with the near instantaneous failure of critical load-bearing elements across multiple floors, he wrote. This failure mode is not consistent with thermal effects from hydrocarbon fires, which would create non-uniform heating and progressive failure. It is, however, consistent with controlled demolition techniques designed to minimize structural resistance during collapse. He included mathematical models showing that even if the fires had weakened the steel by 50%, far more than the official reports claimed, the remaining structure should have provided significant resistance to collapse. The floors should have fallen irregularly, the core columns should have remained standing, and the overall collapse time should have been significantly longer. It is akin to a car falling through the bottom of a multi-storey parking garage, he wrote, with each floor providing progressively less resistance, despite having suffered no structural damage. The physics simply do not support the official explanation. The article was peer-reviewed and published in March 2002. 3 months later, Dr. Thorne's research funding was terminated. By the end of the year, the journal itself had ceased publication, its parent organisation citing financial difficulties and changing market conditions. But Mara's investigation revealed a more complex story. Cross-referencing the journal's subscription database with the author affiliations in Dr. Thorne's article, she discovered that 7 of the 12 peer reviewers who had approved the paper were subsequently denied tenure, transferred to non-research positions, or had their federal funding mysteriously disappear. The systematic dismantling of the academic infrastructure that had supported the questioning of the official narrative was surgical in its precision. Dr. Thorne himself became a new obsession. His university profile, archived on the Internet Wayback Machine, showed a distinguished career spanning 4 decades, with over 200 published papers and millions of dollars in research grants. But in early 2002, his page was updated to show that he had taken an indefinite sabbatical for personal reasons. She dug deeper, following a trail through archived academic mailing lists, conference proceedings, and professional networking sites. The last traces of Dr. Thorne's professional existence were found in a niche engineering message board devoted to structural failure analysis. The forum had been active from 1997 to 2003, when it was apparently taken offline permanently. But Mara had learned to look in the forgotten corners of the internet, the places where data went to die but never quite disappeared. Using advanced search techniques and cached page reconstructions, she found fragments of the discussion threads. Dr. Thorne's final posts were increasingly frantic in tone. He described pressure from university administrators, threats to his family's safety, and mysterious visitors who claimed to be federal investigators but carried no proper identification. His last post, dated September 15, 2002, exactly 1 year and 4 days after the attacks, was brief and chilling. The data is the data. Mathematical models don't lie. Steel doesn't care about politics, and gravity is not a government agency. They can threaten my funding, my reputation, even my family. But they can't change the laws of physics. I've said all I can. To those still listening, they're watching. I suggest you all be careful what you look for. You might not like what finds you back. He never posted again. A follow-up news search revealed a brief article from the Chicago Tribune, buried on page 7 of the Metro section 6 months later. University professor missing. Foul play not suspected. The article was perfunctory, almost dismissive. Dr. Thorne had been reported missing by his sister when he failed to appear for Christmas dinner. His car was found at O'Hare Airport, keys in the ignition, a plane ticket to Vancouver in his name unused at the gate. Professor Thorne had been under considerable stress related to academic disputes, an unnamed university spokesperson was quoted as saying. This appears to be a case of someone needing to start fresh somewhere else. But there was no trail after that. No credit card usage, no bank withdrawals, no rental agreements or employment records under his name, or any obvious aliases. Dr. Aris Thorne, a man who had spent 40 years building a paper trail of academic achievement, had simply evaporated. Mara closed her eyes in the sterile library lighting, the weight of the revelation settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. The systematic silencing hadn't been limited to Dr. Thorne. As she continued her research, she found a pattern of structural engineers, metallurgists, and physics professors who had raised questions about the official collapse narrative in those crucial first months after the attacks. All of them had faced professional consequences. All of them had been marginalised, defunded or discredited, and all of them had eventually stopped asking questions about September 11th. The few who continued their research had moved to other countries, found positions in private industry, or simply disappeared from the academic record entirely. What remained was a consensus not of discovery but of survival, a scientific community that had learned, through selective pressure and systematic intimidation, that certain questions would not be tolerated. The official story wasn't just the accepted version of events, it was the only version that was professionally survivable. As she gathered her notes and prepared to leave the library, Mara felt exposed under the flickering fluorescent lights. The paranoia was no longer abstract. It was a physical sensation, a cold certainty that she was being observed, catalogued, evaluated for the threat she might represent. The knowledge she was accumulating had a price, she realised, and others had already paid it. The question now was whether she would be added to the list of people who had learned too much for their own good. The feeling of being watched had evolved from paranoia into operational security. Mara began varying her routines, taking different routes home, using cash for purchases, and conducting her most sensitive research from internet cafes and public libraries, rather than her home computer. She had read enough about surveillance to know that once you were on someone's radar, digital footprints became roadmaps to your location and intentions. She also began using layered VPNs, routing her internet traffic through servers in countries with strong privacy laws, and communicating through encrypted channels that existed in the shadow spaces of the internet. Her investigation moved from mainstream archives to the digital underworld where disgruntled employees, amateur researchers, and information brokers traded in data that governments preferred to keep buried. It was in one such forum, a dark website dedicated to air disaster investigations and aviation anomalies, that she encountered the handle at Radar Ghost. His initial posts in the 9/11 section were bitter rants about cover-ups and government lies, the kind of conspiracy theorising that most serious researchers ignored. But buried in his rambling messages were technical details that could only have come from someone with intimate knowledge of air traffic control systems. After weeks of careful cultivation, building trust through shared technical knowledge and encrypted private messages, that Radar Ghost agreed to share something that had haunted him for over 20 years. "This will cost me everything if it's traced back to me," he wrote, in a message encrypted with military-grade protocols. "I was working approach control at a facility that doesn't exist in any official record. We had primary radar coverage of the entire East Coast corridor. I saw things that morning that were scrubbed from every official database, but I kept copies. Insurance, you understand. Don't disappoint me." The file arrived 3 days later, a massive data dump disguised as a corrupted email attachment. When Mara finally decrypted and decompressed it, she found herself staring at 24 hours of raw primary radar returns from September 11th, 2001, not the sanitized transponder data that appeared in official reports, but the unfiltered radar reflections from every object in the sky over the eastern United States. The data was overwhelming. Commercial airliners, private jets, military aircraft, weather balloons, and the electronic noise that cluttered the airspace of the world's busiest aviation corridor. It took her days to write filtering algorithms, cleaning the data, and tracking specific radar signatures through the chaos. She focused first on American Airlines Flight 77, the Boeing 757 that had allegedly struck the Pentagon. The official story was straightforward. The flight had departed Dulles International Airport on schedule, proceeded normally for 36 minutes, then turned off its transponder over southern Ohio, made a wide U-turn back toward Washington, and descended into the Pentagon at high speed. But the raw radar data told a more complex story. The transponder signal for Flight 77 did indeed vanish over Ohio at 8:56 a.m., exactly as the official report stated. But the primary radar target, the physical reflection from the aircraft itself, continued westward for another 63 nautical miles before it simply disappeared from the screen. It didn't fade gradually or descend below radar coverage. It vanished instantly, as if the aircraft had been switched off like a light bulb. Simultaneously, a new primary target appeared on the scope near the West Virginia border, moving southeast at 540 knots toward Washington, D.C. This new radar signature had the exact characteristics of a Boeing 757. The same cross-sectional area, the same speed capabilities, the same flight profile. But according to the official timeline, the real Flight 77 was already well to the east and no longer under radar coverage. The timing was surgical in its precision. The original target disappeared at exactly 9:09:32 am. The new target appeared at 9:09:34 am, 2 seconds later and 60 miles to the south. It was as if the aircraft had been teleported, or as if one plane had been replaced by another in a carefully choreographed handoff. Radar Ghost's encrypted messages provided context. See it now? The swap. We called it aircraft substitution in our training manuals, something the military practices during war games when they need to simulate different aircraft types or flight profiles. They paint a new bird on the screen using electronic countermeasures, make the old one disappear using radar jammers. We saw what they wanted us to see. Mara cross-referenced the radar data with archived flight tracking information from that morning. The pattern became even more disturbing when she examined United Airlines Flight 175, which had struck the South Tower. Like Flight 77, its transponder signal disappeared over New Jersey, but the primary radar returns showed the aircraft continuing north for another 40 miles, before vanishing and being replaced by a different target that descended into Manhattan. The implications were staggering. The radar evidence suggested that the aircraft everyone watched strike the World Trade Center and Pentagon were not the original commercial flights. They were substitutes, introduced into the airspace during the confusion of the morning's military exercises. But substitutes for what? If the original flights hadn't crashed into the buildings, what had happened to them? And what exactly had struck the towers? Her correspondence with Radar Ghost became increasingly cryptic as he realized the magnitude of what he had revealed. His final message was short and urgent. They know I've been talking. Moving the family tonight. The data you have is real, but is only part of the picture. Look for the fighter jets that weren't supposed to be there. Look for the electronic warfare signatures. And whatever you do, don't trust anyone who claims to be trying to help you. The people who did this have been cleaning up loose ends for 20 years. The account at Radar Ghost went dark after that message. When Mara tried to reach him through back-channel communications, she found that all his digital identities had been systematically erased. Email accounts closed, forum profiles deleted, encrypted messaging services showing no record of his user credentials. It was as if he had never existed. But the radar data remained, a digital fossil of a truth that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal. The morning of September 11th hadn't just been a terrorist attack, it had been the largest military deception operation in modern history, a shell game played with passenger aircraft while the world watched in horror. The question that now consumed Mara's every waking moment was simple and terrifying. If the planes that struck the buildings weren't the original flights, and if the original flights had been made to disappear somewhere over the American heartland, then who was responsible for the greatest aviation magic trick ever performed? And more importantly, what had happened to the 244 people who had been aboard those vanished aircraft? The scope of the deception was threatening to overwhelm her analytical capabilities. Aircraft substitution, media manipulation, academic intimidation. The threads were weaving together into a pattern so vast and complex that her rational mind struggled to process it. She needed something concrete, something that operated according to simpler rules than military operations or information warfare. She needed to follow the money. Financial markets were brutal in their honesty. Numbers didn't lie, couldn't be intimidated into silence, and left paper trails that were nearly impossible to completely erase. If someone had advanced knowledge of the attacks, they would have found ways to profit from that knowledge, and those profits would be traceable. Mara spent her remaining savings on access to premium financial databases and trading analysis software. She focused on the 3 trading days immediately preceding September 11th, 2001, looking for anomalies that screamed inside knowledge. The first anomaly was so blatant it seemed impossible that it hadn't been front-page news for months. Put options, essentially bets that a stock's price would fall, had spiked to unprecedented levels for American Airlines and United Airlines stock. The volume was not just unusual, it was statistically impossible without advanced knowledge. American Airlines put options had increased by 1,300%, above normal volume on September the 6th and 7th. United Airlines puts had spiked by 1,100% over the same period. Someone had wagered hundreds of millions of dollars that these 2 specific airlines, and only these 2 airlines, were about to experience catastrophic losses. But the betting wasn't limited to the airlines. Insurance companies had been targeted with similar precision. Marsh & McLennan, the insurance brokerage that occupied floors 93 to 100 of the North Tower, had been hit with massive put option purchases. So had Swiss Re and Munich Re, two reinsurance giants that would face billions in claims from the attacks. Even more specifically, put options had been purchased against Morgan Stanley, Merrill Lynch, and other financial firms that had major offices in the World Trade Center complex. The pattern was surgical. Only companies that would be directly impacted by the destruction of the towers were targeted for bearish betting. The profits from these trades, had they been collected, would have totaled over $2.5 billion. It was the most successful short-selling operation in financial history, predicated on advanced knowledge of one of the most devastating attacks in human history. Mara traced the trading orders through a labyrinth of financial intermediaries. The initial purchases had been placed through a network of small brokerages in Germany, Switzerland and Japan, locations chosen for their bank secrecy laws and regulatory opacity. But using advanced financial forensic software, she was able to peel back the layers of financial obfuscation. The ultimate source of funding led to a Russian bank called Seveny Trust, which intelligence analysts had identified as a clearinghouse for money laundering operations tied to former Soviet intelligence services. But even that wasn't the end of the trail. The most chilling discovery came when she traced what had happened to the profits. The put options had not been exercised. In the days following September 11th, when these trades would have generated enormous profits, they had been quietly abandoned. The traders had walked away from $2.5 billion rather than claim winnings that would have created an obvious money trail leading back to the conspiracy. But Mara's analysis revealed that equivalent amounts of money had simultaneously appeared in accounts tied to defence contractors and private military companies. Blackwater, Halliburton, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, corporations that would become the primary beneficiaries of the post-9/11 military-industrial complex, had received massive, mysterious capital injections in the weeks following the attacks. The money hadn't been collected as trading profits, which would have triggered regulatory investigations. Instead, it had been recycled through a complex network of shell corporations and offshore accounts, ultimately funding the very companies that would profit most from the subsequent War on Terror. She cross-referenced this financial data with stock performance in the months following the attacks. Defence contractor stocks had exploded in value. Blackwater had grown from a small military training company to a billion-dollar private army. Halliburton had received no-bid contracts worth hundreds of billions of dollars. The weapons manufacturers had seen their stock prices triple as America embarked on 2 decades of perpetual warfare. The pattern was inescapable. The same financial networks that had bet against the airlines and insurance companies had positioned themselves to profit enormously from the military response to the attacks. It was a perfect financial strategy. Short the targets, invest in the solution, then create the crisis that makes both positions profitable. But the most damning evidence came from an analysis of the timing. The put options hadn't just been purchased in the days before the attacks. They had been strategically timed to expire on September 21st, 2001, exactly 10 days after the attacks. This wasn't random speculation or lucky guessing. It was a precisely calibrated financial operation designed to maximize profits from advanced knowledge of a specific date. Mara sat back in her chair, the weight of the discovery crushing down on her. She had always imagined that if 9/11 was an inside job, it would be motivated by grand geopolitical strategy, ideological fanaticism, or the pursuit of imperial power. The reality was both more mundane and more horrifying. It was about money. The attacks weren't just a catalyst for reshaping global politics. They were the centerpiece of the most profitable investment strategy in human history. The towers had fallen, 3,000 people had died, and 2 decades of war had followed, all to execute a financial plan that had generated trillions of dollars for a small group of investors who had known exactly what was going to happen and when. She began mapping the ownership structures of the shell companies that had received the laundered profits. The network was vast and sophisticated, but patterns emerged. Many of the ultimate beneficiaries were names she recognized from business headlines. Defense industry executives, private equity firms specializing in military contractors, and investment funds that had emerged from nowhere in the early 2000s to become major players in the military-industrial complex. But one name kept appearing in her analysis, buried deep in the ownership structures and corporate boards: Meridian Group, a private investment firm that seemed to exist at the nexus of defence contracting, intelligence services and international finance. Every financial thread she followed eventually led back to companies with Meridian connections. Meridian Group had been founded in 1999 by former intelligence officials and Wall Street executives. Its public portfolio focused on emerging security technologies and crisis management solutions. But Mara's research revealed that it also held controlling interests in companies across the entire 9/11 profit chain. The defence contractors who built the weapons, the private military companies who fought the wars, the surveillance technology firms who monitored the homeland, and the financial institutions that funded the entire operation. It was a vertically integrated conspiracy, a corporate structure designed to profit from every aspect of the post-9/11 world. And if her analysis was correct, the same people who had financed the attacks had then positioned themselves to profit from the response, creating a closed loop of violence and profit that had sustained itself for over 2 decades. The scope of the financial conspiracy was staggering, but it also provided something that the other evidence had lacked: concrete proof of premeditation. Markets might be manipulated, radar might be spoofed, and media might be controlled, but money trails were nearly impossible to completely obscure. The put options were smoking gun evidence that someone had known exactly what was going to happen on September 11th, and had invested billions of dollars to profit from that knowledge. As she compiled her financial research into a comprehensive report, Mara realized she was no longer just investigating a terrorist attack. She was mapping the architecture of a shadow economy built on manufactured crisis, where the same people who created the problems also owned the companies that sold the solutions. The question was no longer whether 9/11 had been an inside job. The financial evidence made that undeniable. The question was how many other crises, how many other wars, how many other national emergencies had been manufactured by the same network of investors who had learned that terror was the most profitable business on Earth. What if the most dangerous secrets aren't hidden in classified files, but buried in plain sight, in the footnotes of forgotten academic papers? What if the government's most classified unit wasn't studying aliens at all, but something far more terrifying? Something that's been manipulating human belief since the dawn of civilization itself. Before we dive into tonight's story, I want to give a shout out to Jeffernan 1772 for suggesting this incredible topic. Your video ideas keep sleep theories going, so please drop your suggestions in the comments below, and if you're enjoying these deep dives into the unknown, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Now let's talk about the Collins Elite, and why they might be the most important government program you've never heard of. I wasn't looking for UFOs, I was looking for a way to pay rent. The gig economy had chewed me up and spit me out more times than I cared to count. Web design, freelance writing, even a brief stint delivering food, nothing stuck. But when Dr. Martinelli at the university offered me work as a research assistant, scanning old theological dissertations for the digital archive, I jumped at it. $25 an hour to sit in a quiet library basement, copying dusty Latin passages and obscure biblical references that nobody had touched in decades. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. The work was mind-numbing mostly. Endless pages of theological debates from the 1950s and 60s, written by seminary students who were probably dead by now. The Augustinian interpretation of angelic hierarchies, post-war perspectives on demonic manifestation, scriptural analysis of divine intervention in modern context. Heavy stuff, but about as exciting as watching paint dry. I'd been at it for 3 months when I found the reference that changed everything. It was October, around 2 a.m. I was halfway through a 1963 thesis titled Angelic Manifestations in Modern Times, 324 pages of dense theological argumentation by a seminarian named Marcus Whitmore. The kind of paper that made me question every life choice that had led me to that basement. I was scanning page 187, a particularly dry section about contemporary witness testimony, when a footnote caught my eye. It wasn't the content that stopped me, it was the context. The main text was discussing reports of luminous beings witnessed by various clergy members throughout the 1950s. Standard religious stuff, the kind of mystical experiences that show up in seminary papers all the time. But the footnote read, "For governmental perspective on similar phenomena, see Collins Elite Memorandum 1957, classification status unknown." I stared at that line for a full minute. It was cited like a real source, with the matter-of-fact tone of academic reference. No explanation, no context, just there. The problem was, this wasn't a section about government or politics. It was about angels. And the thesis was written by a seminary student, not a political science major. So why was he referencing what sounded like a classified government document in the middle of a paper about divine manifestations? I made a note and kept scanning, but the reference nagged at me. Collins Elite. It sounded official, maybe military, but why would a religious scholar in 1963 have access to classified material, and why would he cite it so casually, as if his readers would know what he was talking about? The next day, I couldn't concentrate on my assigned documents. Instead, I found myself searching the university's digital catalogue for any mention of Collins Elite. Nothing came up in the main database, but I had access to some of the restricted theological archives through Dr. Martinelli's login credentials. That's where I found the second reference. It was in a 1959 lecture transcript from a Catholic seminary in Maryland. The speaker was Father Benedict Toretti, discussing unusual spiritual encounters in the post-war era. Most of the lecture was standard theological fare, but near the end, during what appeared to be an informal Q&A session, someone asked about government interest in religious phenomena. Father Toretti's response was brief but loaded. There are those in Washington who understand that not all mysteries can be solved with science. The Collins Elite represents a different approach to certain questions, but we must be careful not to mistake understanding for wisdom or documentation for truth. The transcript noted uncomfortable silence after this comment, and the lecture ended shortly thereafter. 2 references, 2 religious contexts, both suggesting that Collins' Elite was some kind of government program dealing with spiritual or supernatural phenomena. But why were religious scholars the only ones talking about it? And why did they all seem nervous about it? I spent the rest of the week diving deeper into the theological archives. The pattern that emerged was both fascinating and disturbing. Collins' Elite didn't show up in UFO journals or conspiracy magazines. It didn't appear in scientific papers or military histories. Instead, it haunted the footnotes of religious documents like a ghost that only clergy could see. A 1958 exorcism report from a priest in New Mexico mentioned consultation with Collins' Elite regarding non-terrestrial influences. A 1962 seminary paper on demonic deception in the modern age included a cryptic reference to Collins' Elite protocols for distinguishing spiritual from extraplanetary phenomena. A 1961 lecture on comparative religion contained a single chilling line. As the Collins Elite has documented, the same entities that once appeared as gods now masquerade as visitors from the stars. Each reference was brief, almost coded, like the authors were speaking to an audience that would understand the implications without needing explanation. And always, the references appeared in contexts dealing with the supernatural, the spiritual, the otherworldly, but never in the way you'd expect. These weren't discussions of government cover-ups or alien conspiracies. They were warnings, theological warnings about deception, about false prophets, about entities that wore whatever mask humanity was willing to believe. I was starting to get a picture of something much stranger than a typical black project. Collins' Elite wasn't studying UFOs the way the Air Force was. They were studying them the way the Catholic Church studied demons. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a misfiled document. I was scanning a collection of 1964 seminary papers when I found something that didn't belong. Mixed in with discussions of Vatican II reforms and modern catechism was a single-page document that looked nothing like the others. It was typed on official letterhead, something called Interdenominational Council on Anomalous Phenomena, and dated March 15th, 1959. The document was brief. Memo. Regarding recent Collins Elite Briefing 2, member institutions from Council Secretary following last week's presentation by Dr. Edward Collins regarding non-corporeal intelligence manifestations. The Council recommends the following protocols for clergy encountering anomalous phenomena. Do not assume extraterrestrial origin 2. Apply traditional discernment practices 3. Document all encounters per Collins Elite Guidelines 4. Report suspected deception campaigns immediately. Remember, the same entities that demanded worship as Baal and Moloch now request our trust as benevolent space brothers. The mask changes, the deception remains constant. Father Michael Torino, Council Secretary. My hands were shaking as I read it. This wasn't just a reference to Collins Elite. This was evidence of direct collaboration between the program and religious institutions. They were briefing clergy on how to handle UFO encounters, but from a theological perspective. And that last paragraph, it was suggesting that UFO entities weren't aliens at all. They were something much older and more dangerous, masquerading as extraterrestrials just as they had once masqueraded as ancient gods. I photographed the document with my phone and started digging into this interdenominational council. What I found made my blood run cold. The Interdenominational Council on Anomalous Phenomena existed from 1957 to 1969, according to what little I could find. Its membership included representatives from major Christian denominations, Jewish religious authorities, and even some Islamic scholars. The council was supposedly formed to coordinate religious response to unusual phenomena in the post-war era. That was the official line anyway. The reality appeared to be much more specific. I found meeting minutes from 1958 that discussed the Collins Elite presentation on entity communication patterns. A 1960 report mentioned successful implementation of Collins Elite discernment protocols in 17 states. A 1962 memorandum warned of increased entity activity coinciding with popular UFO narratives. The council wasn't just studying religious phenomena in general, they were specifically focused on what they called entity encounters, and they were working directly with Collins' elite to develop responses. The most disturbing document I found was a 1961 report titled Spiritual Warfare in the Space Age. It outlined what the council believed to be a deliberate deception campaign by non-human entities. Historical analysis suggests consistent behavioural patterns across millennia. Entities appearing as divine beings in ancient times demanded worship, sacrifice, and absolute obedience. Modern manifestations as space visitors request trust, cooperation, and technological exchange. The underlying objective, human subjugation, remains unchanged. The report went on to detail specific cases where UFO contactees had reported entities claiming to be from various star systems, but whose messages contained elements identical to ancient religious texts describing demonic deception. According to the council's analysis, the entities were running the same con they'd always run. They just updated their costumes for each era. As I dug deeper into the council's documents, I started to notice something unsettling. My research wasn't going unnoticed. It started small. Dr. Martinelli mentioned that someone had been asking about my work. Just routine monitoring, he said, but he looked uncomfortable about it. Then I noticed that some of the documents I'd photographed were being moved to different sections of the archive. Files that had been easily accessible suddenly required special permission to view. The final warning came on a Tuesday night in November. I was alone in the archive basement scanning a particularly interesting 1963 document about Collins Elite Field Operations, when my computer screen flickered. The document disappeared, replaced by a simple text message. "Stop looking, they're not what you think." I stared at the screen, heart pounding. Someone was monitoring my research in real time. Someone with access to the university's network, and probably a lot more than that. I should have stopped then. Any reasonable person would have backed off, found a different job, maybe moved to a different city. But I wasn't reasonable anymore. I was obsessed, and besides, whoever was watching had just confirmed that I was onto something real. I replied by typing into the same text box that had appeared on my screen. "Then what are they?" The response came immediately. "They've worn every mask we've ever worshipped." The screen flickered again, and the message disappeared. But the implication was crystal clear. Collins' elite wasn't just studying UFO entities. They'd concluded that these entities were the same beings that had manipulated human religious belief throughout history. Ancient gods, modern aliens, same entities, different costumes. After the warning, access to documents became nearly impossible. Files went missing. Archives were suddenly under renovation. Dr. Martinelli stopped returning my emails. It was clear that my research had triggered some kind of response from whoever wanted Collins' elite to remain buried. But I'd already seen enough to piece together the broad outline of their doctrine. Collins' elite appeared to be a small classified unit within the US government that approached the UFO phenomenon from a religious rather than scientific perspective. Based on the scattered evidence I'd found, their core beliefs seemed to be UFO entities were not extraterrestrial visitors. They were the same non-corporeal beings that had interacted with humans throughout history. These entities had consistently masqueraded as whatever humans were most likely to worship or trust. Their ultimate goal was the spiritual subjugation of humanity. The modern UFO phenomenon was simply their latest deception campaign. The unit apparently worked closely with religious leaders to develop protocols for identifying and resisting entity influence. They studied religious texts not for historical interest, but for tactical intelligence about entity behaviour patterns. They viewed exorcists and clergy as frontline personnel in a spiritual war that most people didn't even know was happening. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to believe they were losing. My research into Collins' elite had taken nearly 6 months, and by December I was running out of leads. The documents had dried up, my access was severely restricted, and I was starting to wonder if I'd ever find anything more concrete than footnotes and oblique references. That's when I decided to look at modern UFO phenomena through the Collins Elite lens. What I found was terrifying in its consistency. Contemporary UFO contactee reports, when examined from a religious perspective, showed the same patterns that Collins Elite had apparently identified in the 1950s. Entities claiming to be from Zeta Reticuli, or the Pleiades, but whose messages contained elements identical to ancient Gnostic texts. Space brothers, preaching salvation through technological advancement, using language that echoed Mesopotamian religious propaganda. Abduction experiences that followed the same psychological patterns as historical demonic possession cases. The modern UFO disclosure movement, viewed through Collins Elite's framework, looked less like a quest for scientific truth and more like the latest phase of an ancient deception campaign. Entities that had once demanded worship as gods now requested trust as benevolent aliens. Same control mechanisms, updated for a scientific age. I started to understand why Collins Elite had worked so closely with religious authorities. If you believe that UFO entities were actually spiritual beings with thousands of years of experience in manipulating human belief systems, then scientists and military analysts were the wrong people to study them. You needed theologians. You needed people who understood the long history of spiritual deception and the psychological mechanisms of faith. You needed people who could recognize the same lie being told with new words. I thought I'd reached the end of my research when I received an unexpected email in January. The sender was listed as archive.recovery@gmail.com, obviously a throwaway account. The message was brief. You've been asking the right questions. Room 847, basement level, manuscript collection. Look behind the Milton volumes. 1 hour only. I almost deleted it. Every instinct told me it was a trap, but the Collins Elite investigation had become an obsession, and I couldn't walk away from what might be my last chance at finding real answers. An hour later, I was in the basement of the manuscript collection, a building I'd never visited before. Room 847 was a cramped storage room filled with old books and filing cabinets. The Milton volumes were easy to find, a complete set of Paradise Lost editions dating back to the 1800s. Behind the books, taped to the back of the shelf, was a manila envelope. Inside was a single document that changed everything I thought I knew about Collins Elite. It was typed on official US government letterhead, dated August 12, 1969, and marked Eyes Only Collins Elite Termination Report. The document was brief but explosive. Memorandum for the record subject, termination of Collins Elite program. Effective immediately. All Collins Elite operations are suspended indefinitely. Program termination follows unanimous recommendation by Collins Elite senior staff. Reason for termination: successful entity infiltration of program hierarchy. Evidence suggests long-term entity influence over program direction since 1961. Collins Elite conclusions regarding entity nature remain valid. However, program itself has been compromised beyond recovery. All Collins Elite personnel are reassigned. All documents classified at highest levels. Religious community partnerships terminated. Interdenominational council dissolved. Public disclosure of Collins Elite findings is prohibited under national security provisions. Final assessment: the entities we sought to understand and counter have proven more sophisticated than anticipated. They have successfully used our own investigation against us, turning our knowledge into a tool for their agenda. The Collins Elite program has become part of the deception we were created to expose. Any future investigation of these phenomena must proceed under the assumption that traditional government and academic institutions are compromised. Minus Dr. Edward Collins, Program Director. I read the document 3 times before the implication sank in. Collins Elite hadn't just been terminated because of budget cuts or bureaucratic reshuffling. It had been terminated because the entities they were studying had infiltrated and co-opted the program itself. The Watchers had been turned into accomplices, and if that was true in 1969, what did it mean for every government UFO program since then? Sitting in that storage room, holding what might be the last authentic Collins Elite document ever created, I finally understood the true scope of what I'd uncovered. Collins' Elite hadn't been a fringe program run by religious zealots. It had been a serious government investigation that reached a conclusion so disturbing that the entities being studied had been forced to destroy it. The program had gotten too close to the truth, so the truth had destroyed the program. But what was that truth? Based on everything I'd found, Collins' Elite had concluded that the UFO phenomenon was not extraterrestrial contact, but rather the latest phase of an ancient psychological operation. Non-corporeal entities, call them demons, call them interdimensional beings, call them whatever you want, had been manipulating human belief systems for millennia. They had appeared as gods to ancient peoples, demanding worship and sacrifice. They had manifested as angels and devils to medieval societies, shaping religious doctrine. And now they were appearing as alien visitors to a technological civilization, promoting their agenda through the language of science and space exploration. The genius of it was that each generation thought they were encountering something new. Ancient peoples saw divine visitation. Medieval believers saw spiritual manifestation. Modern witnesses see extraterrestrial contact. But according to Collins' Elite, it was always the same entities, always running the same basic deception, always working toward the same goal, the spiritual and psychological subjugation of humanity. The entities had realized that direct worship was no longer feasible in a scientific age, so they had adapted, presenting themselves as technologically advanced aliens who could offer humanity salvation through scientific advancement. Instead of demanding worship, they requested trust. Instead of requiring sacrifice, they asked for cooperation. But the underlying dynamic remained the same, humans giving up their autonomy to beings who claimed to have their best interests at heart. And if Collins' Elite was right, the modern UFO disclosure movement was simply the latest phase of this deception campaign. The termination document explained why I'd never heard of Collins' Elite in any mainstream UFO research. It wasn't being covered up by the government to hide alien contact. It was being covered up because the government itself had been compromised by the entities Collins' Elite was studying. Think about it. Every major government UFO program since Collins' Elite, Project Blue Book, AA-TIP, the UAP Task Force, had approached the phenomenon from a purely technological perspective. They studied craft capabilities, flight patterns, potential propulsion systems. They never asked the questions Collins' Elite had been asking. What do these entities actually want? Why do their messages always promote dependence rather than independence? Why do their promises of enlightenment always require surrender of human agency? Those questions weren't being ignored by accident. According to the termination document, they were being actively suppressed by entities who had learned to work within government and academic institutions. The modern UFO research community, the disclosure advocates, the scientists studying anomalous aerial phenomena, they might all be sincere in their efforts, but they were asking the wrong questions. They were looking for extraterrestrial contact when they should have been looking for spiritual deception. And that meant that every major UFO revelation of the past 50 years might actually be part of the deception Collins' Elite had tried to expose. I left that storage room with more questions than answers, but one thing was crystal clear. Collins' Elite had tried to warn us, and we hadn't listened. Worse, we might not be capable of listening, because the entities they warned us about had apparently learned to control the conversation. Over the following weeks, I tried to verify the termination document through official channels. I filed Freedom of Information Act requests. I contacted government historians. I reached out to former intelligence officials. The responses were universally the same. No record of any program called Collins' Elite existed in official government files. But that didn't mean the program had never existed. It just meant that someone had been very thorough in erasing it. The more I thought about it, the more the Collins' Elite scenario made sense of things that had always bothered me about the UFO phenomenon. Why did entity messages always promote technological dependence rather than spiritual development? Why did alien contact always require humans to abandon their traditional belief systems? Why did every promised revelation turn out to be just another layer of mystery? According to Collins' Elite, it was because the entities weren't trying to enlighten us. They were trying to control us. and the best way to control a technologically advanced species was to convince them that salvation could only come through higher technology, provided by beings who claimed to have humanity's best interests at heart. The ancient formula updated for a scientific age. After finding the termination document, I thought my Collins Elite investigation was over, but 2 weeks later I received another cryptic email from the same archive. Recovery account. You found the termination report. Good. Now find the real archive. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, Georgetown University Theology Department. Tell her Marcus sent you. I almost ignored it. The rational part of my brain was screaming that I was already in too deep, that whoever was feeding me information might be leading me into something dangerous. But the name Marcus rang a bell. Marcus Whitmore, the author of that first 1963 thesis, where I'd found the Collins Elite reference. Could he still be alive? Dr. Rodriguez's office was in a converted Victorian house on the Georgetown campus, tucked between the main theology building and an old chapel. When I mentioned that Marcus had sent me, her reaction was immediate and alarming. She locked her office door, closed the blinds, and pulled out a device I later learned was a radio frequency detector. 62 years, she said quietly, sweeping the device around the room. 62 years Marcus has been waiting for someone to follow the trail far enough to find him. He's 91 years old and still afraid they're listening. Dr. Rodriguez led me through a maze of basement corridors beneath the theology building to a climate-controlled storage room I never could have found on my own. Inside, Marcus Whitmore sat surrounded by filing cabinets that looked like they'd been moved there decades ago. He was ancient, but his eyes were sharp and alert. "You're the one asking about Collins Elite," he said. It wasn't a question. "Eleanor tells me you found the termination report. That means they decided you were ready." They? The survivors. The ones who got out before the infiltration was complete. He gestured to the filing cabinets around us. "We've been maintaining our own archive for over 50 years. Everything the government tried to bury, we preserved. What Marcus showed me over the next 6 hours changed everything I thought I knew about Collins Elite, and about the scope of the deception they had uncovered. Collins Elite hadn't begun as a government program at all. It had started in 1947 as an informal network of military officers, intelligence analysts and religious scholars who were disturbed by early UFO reports. What bothered them wasn't the craft themselves, but the messages being delivered by the entities inside them. The contactee movement was just getting started, Marcus explained, pulling out files from the late 1940s. George Adamski, Daniel Fry, Truman Bethurum, all these people claiming contact with benevolent space brothers. But when you analysed their messages from a theological perspective, they weren't promoting human spiritual development. They were promoting dependence. The early Collins Elite had conducted detailed analyses of contactee messages and found disturbing patterns. The entities consistently promoted several key themes: the inadequacy of human religion, the necessity of technological advancement, the benefits of surrendering human decision-making to superior beings, and the dangers of independent spiritual development. It was the same psychological framework used by every cult in history, Dr. Rodriguez added. Isolate the subject from their support systems, convince them that traditional sources of guidance are inadequate, then position yourself as the only reliable source of truth. But Collins Elite's analysis went deeper than simple cult mechanics. They had identified specific linguistic and conceptual patterns that appeared across different contactee cases, patterns that matched historical accounts of demonic deception dating back thousands of years. Marcus showed me a 1952 analysis comparing Adamski's alleged conversations with Venusian beings to transcripts from 16th century witch trials. The parallels were undeniable. The same promises of secret knowledge, the same dismissal of conventional morality, the same emphasis on the chosen status of the contactee. That's when we knew we were dealing with something ancient, Marcus said. These weren't aliens from space. They were the same entities that had been manipulating human belief systems since the beginning of recorded history. By 1957, Collins Elite had attracted official government attention. The CIA and military intelligence were struggling to understand the UFO phenomenon from a technological perspective, but Collins Elite was approaching it from an entirely different angle, and getting results. We could predict contactee behaviour patterns, Dr. Rodriguez explained. We could identify which cases were likely to be genuine entity contact versus hoaxes or psychological episodes. We could even predict what messages the entities would deliver in future contacts. This predictive ability had made Collins Elite invaluable to government agencies dealing with UFO incidents. But it had also made them a target. Marcus pulled out a thick file labelled Entity Response Patterns, 1958 to 1961. Inside were dozens of reports documenting how UFO activity and contactee experiences changed in response to Collins Elite investigations. Whenever we got too close to exposing their methods, they would shift tactics, Marcus said. Study their linguistic patterns too closely, and suddenly contactees would start receiving messages in completely different styles. Document their technological claims, and they would start demonstrating entirely different capabilities. The entities weren't just running a deception campaign. They were actively monitoring the investigators and adapting their approach in real time. But the most disturbing pattern was personal targeting. Collins Elite members began experiencing their own anomalous encounters, but these experiences were clearly designed to discredit or manipulate the investigators, rather than provide genuine contact. Dr. Edward Collins himself was contacted in 1960, Marcus revealed. The entity claimed to be from Rigel and offered to provide him with advanced technology in exchange for shutting down the Collins Elite program. When he refused, the encounters became increasingly threatening. Other Collins Elite members reported similar experiences, contact attempts that seemed designed to either co-opt them or drive them out of the program entirely. The entities were fighting back. The termination document I'd found told only part of the story. The real disaster began in 1961 when Collins Elite was formally incorporated into the government's UFO investigation apparatus. That was our mistake, Marcus said bitterly. We thought official recognition would give us more resources, better access to witness testimony, protection from entity retaliation. Instead, it gave them access to us. With official status came new personnel assignments, government oversight, and integration with other classified programs. Collins Elite's small, tight-knit network of trusted researchers was suddenly flooded with new members whose backgrounds couldn't be thoroughly vetted. The infiltration was subtle at first, Dr. Rodriguez explained. New analysts who would subtly shift the focus of investigations, administrative personnel who would lose crucial documents, supervisors who would redirect resources toward more promising lines of inquiry. By 1965, original Collins Elite members were reporting that their research conclusions were being systematically altered before reaching higher-level officials. Analyses emphasizing the deceptive nature of entity contact were being rewritten to focus on potential technological benefits. Warnings about spiritual manipulation were being deleted entirely. Marcus showed me internal memos from 1966 to 1968, documenting the growing suspicion among original Collins Elite members that their program had been compromised. They began conducting parallel investigations using secure channels, trying to determine whether the infiltration was the result of foreign intelligence operations, bureaucratic incompetence, or something more sinister. By 1968, we had our answer, Marcus said grimly. It was the entities themselves. They had learned to work through human intermediaries, people who might not even be consciously aware that they were being influenced. The evidence was subtle but damning. New Collins Elite personnel consistently made decisions that served entity interests, redirecting investigations away from deception analysis, promoting contactees who delivered pro-entity messages, suppressing research that exposed manipulation tactics. The final proof came when Dr. Collins tried to present his findings to the Defense Intelligence Agency in 1969, Dr. Rodriguez said. His presentation was completely rewritten between the time he submitted it and the time it was delivered. Instead of warning about entity deception, it recommended increased cooperation with UFO intelligences. That was when the original Collins Elite members realized their program had been completely subverted. The Watchers had become the Watched, and the Watched had become the Watchers. Rather than fight a battle they couldn't win within government channels, the original Collins Elite members made a radical decision. They would fake the program's termination while secretly continuing their research through private channels. The termination report you found was genuine, Marcus explained, but it wasn't the end of Collins' elite. It was the beginning of the real investigation. Using their existing contacts within religious institutions, academia and government, the Collins elite survivors established a covert network for continuing their research. They couldn't publish their findings or seek official recognition, but they could continue gathering evidence and developing their understanding of the entity deception campaign. "We've been operating continuously for over 50 years, Dr. Rodriguez said, documenting entity activity, analysing their evolving strategies, tracking their infiltration of various institutions. The underground Collins elite had identified several key developments since 1969. The entities had largely abandoned individual contactee operations in favour of influencing institutions directly. Rather than delivering messages through isolated individuals who could be easily dismissed, they were now working through respected scientists, government officials and religious leaders. They had also shifted their primary narrative from spiritual enlightenment to technological salvation. Instead of promising cosmic consciousness or spiritual advancement, they were now focusing on environmental solutions, clean energy, and space exploration. Most significantly, they had begun preparing for mass disclosure rather than gradual revelation. The underground Collins elite believed this represented the final phase of a deception campaign that had been in development for decades. Marcus and Dr. Rodriguez walked me through 50 years of documented entity influence on human institutions. The pattern was consistent but sophisticated. Entities never directly controlled human behaviour, but they influenced it through carefully orchestrated synchronicities, technological inspirations, and strategic information releases. "Look at the development of computer technology," Dr. Rodriguez said, showing me files documenting unusual technological leaps in electronics and computing since the 1960s. Every major breakthrough happened shortly after UFO encounters involving personnel who were in positions to influence research directions. The entities weren't providing blueprints or direct technological assistance. Instead, they were inspiring specific lines of research, guiding human scientists toward discoveries that served long-term entity interests. The internet, social media, artificial intelligence, all of these technologies have made humanity more connected but also more controllable, Marcus observed. They've created systems that can monitor and influence human behaviour on a global scale. According to underground Collins elite analysis, the entities had been systematically encouraging the development of technologies that would make mass psychological manipulation easier, while simultaneously making individual privacy and independence more difficult. But the most disturbing revelation was their analysis of the modern UFO disclosure movement itself. Every major disclosure advocate, every government whistleblower, every scientist calling for serious UFO research, we've documented anomalous encounters in their backgrounds, Dr. Rodriguez said. They're not consciously working for the entities, but they're all promoting the same basic narrative, that UFO contact is inevitable, beneficial, and should be embraced rather than resisted. The underground Collins elite had identified specific psychological themes being promoted through disclosure advocates: the inadequacy of human civilization, the necessity of outside intervention, the benefits of technological advancement over spiritual development, and the dangers of resistance to contact. It's the same message the contactees were delivering in the 1950s, Marcus said, just delivered through more credible sources and backed by more sophisticated evidence. According to the underground Collins elite's analysis, the current disclosure campaign was preparation for something unprecedented: open entity contact with humanity as a whole, rather than selected individuals. They've spent 70 years testing human responses, refining their approach, identifying the most effective manipulation strategies, Dr. Rodriguez explained. Now they're ready to scale up. The evidence they showed me was circumstantial but compelling. Government UFO programs consistently focused on technological aspects while ignoring behavioural and psychological elements. Scientific studies of anomalous phenomena emphasised physical measurements, while dismissing witness testimony about entity motivations. Media coverage promoted wonder and excitement about potential contact, while discouraging analysis of entity intentions. They're engineering consent, Marcus said, creating a cultural context where open contact will be seen as humanity's graduation to a higher level of existence rather than submission to a superior intelligence. The underground Collins elite believed that formal contact would be presented as humanity's invitation to join a galactic community, with entities offering technological solutions to environmental problems, social conflicts and resource limitations. The offer would seem generous, beneficial and desperately needed. But according to their analysis, acceptance would come with costs that wouldn't become apparent until it was too late. The gradual replacement of human decision-making systems with entity-guided alternatives, the erosion of individual agency in favour of collective efficiency, and the redefinition of human spiritual development to align with entity objectives. It won't feel like conquest, Dr. Rodriguez said. It will feel like salvation, right up until the moment humans realise they've traded their freedom for security, and they're no longer capable of making that trade in reverse. After hours of reviewing evidence and analysis, I asked the obvious question. If the underground Collins elite was right about entity intentions, what could be done to counter them? Marcus and Dr. Rodriguez exchanged glances before Marcus answered carefully. Individual resistance is possible but difficult, he said. The entities rely on collective consent and institutional cooperation. They can't force contact on humans who genuinely reject it, but they can make such rejection seem irrational, antisocial or harmful. The underground Collins elite had developed what they called spiritual inoculation, techniques for recognizing and resisting entity influence. These included traditional religious practices like prayer and meditation, but also more analytical approaches, questioning the source and motivation behind any message promoting dependence, examining whether proposed solutions increased or decreased human agency, and maintaining strong connections to human community and traditional wisdom. The entities are masters of isolation and dependency, Dr. Rodriguez explained. Their influence is weakest when humans are connected to each other and to their own spiritual traditions, and strongest when individuals feel cut off from community and traditional sources of guidance. But individual resistance wouldn't be enough if the entities succeeded in achieving mass consent for contact. The underground Collins elite believed that their most important function was preserving and disseminating knowledge about entity deception methods, so that future generations would have the tools needed to recognize and resist manipulation. That's why we've maintained this archive, Marcus said, and why we're sharing it with you now. The disclosure campaign is accelerating, and we may not have much time left to prepare people for what's coming. As I write this, the UFO disclosure movement is reaching a crescendo. Government officials are admitting that anomalous aerial phenomena are real. Military personnel are testifying about encounters with craft displaying impossible capabilities. Scientists are calling for serious study of the phenomenon. The public is being prepared for some kind of revelation. But if Collins' elite was right, that revelation might be the culmination of a deception campaign that began thousands of years ago. Think about how perfectly the current disclosure narrative fits the Collins elite framework. We're being told that non-human intelligence has been monitoring humanity, that these beings possess technology that could solve our energy and environmental problems, that contact is inevitable and potentially beneficial. We're being encouraged to view disclosure as a positive development, a step forward in human evolution. But what if it's actually the final step in a plan that began when the first human looked at the sky and wondered if the gods were watching? The entities Collins' elite studied had thousands of years to perfect their understanding of human psychology. They knew that direct domination would eventually fail, that humans would rebel against obvious tyranny, but they also knew that humans could be convinced to surrender their autonomy willingly, if the surrender was framed as enlightenment or advancement. The promise of godhood had worked for ancient peoples, the promise of salvation had worked for medieval societies, and the promise of technological transcendence might be working on us right now. Marcus and Dr. Rodriguez had given me a framework for understanding the entity deception campaign, but they also gave me something more practical, a list of specific indicators that the final phase was beginning. We've been tracking these markers for decades, Dr. Rodriguez explained, showing me a comprehensive timeline of predicted developments. When all of them align, it means the entities believe humanity is ready for open contact. The first indicator was mainstream media normalization of UFO phenomena, not just reporting on UFO incidents, but actively promoting the idea that contact would be beneficial. According to their analysis, this phase had begun in earnest around 2017 and was accelerating rapidly. The second indicator was government disclosure of UAP reality without disclosure of government conclusions about entity intentions. They're admitting the phenomena are real, while carefully avoiding any discussion of what the entities actually want, Marcus noted. This creates public curiosity without public wariness. The third indicator was increased entity activity designed to demonstrate technological superiority while maintaining plausible deniability. The recent UAP videos released by the Pentagon fit this pattern perfectly. Clear evidence of advanced technology, but no direct communication or obvious threat. The fourth indicator was the emergence of credible advocates for contact within scientific, military, and government institutions. People with impressive credentials and no obvious ulterior motives, all promoting the same basic message: that humanity should welcome contact rather than fear it. Look at the current disclosure advocates, Dr. Rodriguez said, showing me biographical information on various scientists and former government officials. Impressive backgrounds, sincere motivations, reasonable arguments, but they're all promoting the same narrative the entities have been pushing for 70 years. The fifth and most disturbing indicator was the systematic suppression of research into entity psychology and motivations. While technological aspects of UAP were receiving increased attention and funding, questions about entity intentions were being dismissed as unscientific or irrelevant. That's how you know the entities are controlling the conversation, Marcus said. Any investigation that might reveal their true agenda gets discredited or defunded, while investigations that support their preferred narrative receive institutional support. According to their tracking system, all 5 indicators were currently active and accelerating. The underground Collins elite believed this meant humanity was within years, possibly months, of formal entity contact. Before I left Georgetown that day, Marcus pulled me aside for a private conversation. "You need to understand what you're walking into," he said quietly. "Everyone who's gotten this deep into Collins elite research has faced the same choice. Drop the investigation or accept that your life is going to change in ways you can't predict or control." He told me about colleagues who had been discredited through carefully orchestrated academic scandals, researchers who had lost funding after questioning entity motivations, investigators who had experienced personal crises that conveniently redirected their attention away from UFO phenomena. The entities don't usually resort to direct intimidation, Marcus explained. It's much more effective to make resistance seem personally costly. Failed relationships, career setbacks, health problems, family conflicts, all timed to coincide with getting too close to the truth. He showed me files documenting the life trajectories of dozens of Collins elite researchers over the past 50 years. The pattern was consistent. People who backed away from the investigation generally experienced improved circumstances, while those who continued faced escalating personal difficulties. "I'm not trying to scare you off," Marcus said, "but you need to know that this isn't just an intellectual exercise. The entities have a vested interest in controlling what humans believe about them, and they've had centuries to develop sophisticated methods for managing troublesome individuals." Dr. Rodriguez had faced similar pressures. Her tenure at Georgetown had been threatened twice due to budget constraints that mysteriously resolved themselves when she temporarily reduced her Collins elite research. Her marriage had ended during a period of intensive investigation into entity influence on religious institutions. Her health had suffered during the years she was most actively documenting entity deception patterns. "But here's the thing," she said. "The difficulties are real, but they're not insurmountable. The entities can make resistance costly, but they can't make it impossible. If they could simply eliminate troublesome humans, Collins elite would never have existed in the first place." She believed that entity limitations were precisely why the deception campaign was necessary. If entities could control human behavior directly, they wouldn't need to spend decades engineering consent for contact. the fact that they relied on manipulation suggested that human free will, while vulnerable to influence, remained fundamentally intact. Over the following months, Marcus and Dr. Rodriguez introduced me to other members of the underground Collins elite network. I was amazed by both the size and diversity of the group. Theologians and physicists, former intelligence analysts and current religious leaders, retired military officers and active researchers. What united them wasn't a shared background or ideology, but a shared conclusion that the UFO phenomenon represented a spiritual threat masquerading as a technological opportunity. Father Michael Torres, a Catholic exorcist based in New Mexico, had been documenting parallels between UFO encounters and demonic possession for 30 years. Dr. Rebecca Walsh, a psychiatrist specializing in religious experiences, had identified specific psychological patterns linking modern abduction accounts to historical accounts of spiritual deception. Colonel James Patterson, retired, former Air Force intelligence, had spent decades analysing UFO incident reports and concluded that entity behaviour was consistent with psychological warfare rather than scientific exploration. Each member of the network brought specialised knowledge and perspective, but all had reached similar conclusions about entity motivations and methods. More importantly, all had experienced some form of pressure or retaliation for their research, confirming the underground Collins elite's assessment that entity influence extended far beyond individual contactee cases. "We're not conspiracy theorists," Dr. Walsh explained during one of our meetings. "We're researchers who followed the evidence to an uncomfortable conclusion. The UFO phenomenon is real, the entities are real, but their intentions aren't what they claim to be." The network had developed sophisticated methods for secure communication and information sharing, operating on the assumption that their activities were being monitored by both government agencies and entity-influenced individuals within those agencies. "We have to assume that any information we share through normal channels will be compromised," Colonel Patterson explained. "But we also can't become so paranoid that we stop sharing information entirely. The entities benefit from our isolation more than our communication." As my involvement with the underground Collins elite deepened, I learned that the network extended far beyond the United States. Religious leaders in Europe, researchers in Asia, indigenous spiritual authorities in South America, all were reporting similar observations about entity activity and deception patterns. Dr. Rodriguez arranged for me to speak with several international contacts via encrypted communication channels. Their perspectives added crucial context to the Collins elite analysis. Brother Antonio Mendez, a Spanish monk who specialized in mystical theology, had been tracking entity influences on contemporary religious movements. His research suggested that entities were actively promoting syncretistic spiritual practices that emphasized cosmic consciousness over traditional religious authority. "They're not attacking religion directly," he explained through a translator. "They're subtly altering it, encouraging beliefs and practices that make humans more receptive to entity guidance and less connected to traditional sources of spiritual wisdom." Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a Japanese researcher studying anomalous phenomena in Buddhist contexts, had identified similar patterns in Asian spiritual communities. Entity influences seem designed to promote meditation practices that open practitioners to external guidance, while discouraging those that strengthened individual discernment and spiritual independence. Maria Santos, a shaman from Peru, described entity encounters that closely paralleled North American UFO contact reports, but framed in terms of traditional indigenous spirituality. The entities consistently promoted abandonment of ancestral traditions in favour of updated spiritual practices more suitable for the modern world. "Same spirits, different masks," she said simply. "They tell each culture what that culture wants to hear, but always with the same goal: make humans depend on them instead of their own traditions and wisdom." The global perspective confirmed the underground Collins elite's assessment that entity activity was coordinated across cultures and belief systems, but adapted to local contexts and expectations. The deception campaign wasn't centered in any particular country or religion. It was targeting human spiritual independence as a universal phenomenon. Based on decades of analysis and current trends, The underground Collins elite had developed a timeline for what they believed would be the final phase of the entity deception campaign. Phase 1, 2020 to 2025, mainstream normalization of UFO phenomena through government disclosure and media coverage. Emphasis on technological aspects while avoiding discussion of entity psychology or motivations. Gradual preparation of public consciousness for the possibility of contact. Phase 2, 2025 to 2030. Increased entity demonstrations designed to showcase technological capabilities and benevolent intentions, possibly including solutions to environmental or energy crises that humanity appears unable to solve independently. Growing public pressure for government contact initiatives. Phase 3, 2030 to 2035, formal contact between entity representatives and human governments. Presentation of comprehensive assistance packages addressing climate change, resource depletion, social conflicts and technological limitations. Initial agreements for limited cooperation and information exchange. Phase 4, 2035 to 2040. Gradual integration of entity guidance into human decision-making systems. Replacement of traditional political, economic and social structures with entity-recommended alternatives. Growing human dependence on entity technology and advice. Phase 5, 2040 plus. Complete transformation of human civilization according to entity specifications. Elimination of independent human spiritual development in favour of entity-directed consciousness evolution. Humanity's transition from independent species to managed resource. The genius of the timeline is that each phase will seem like humanity's choice, Dr. Rodriguez explained. People will vote for leaders who support contact. They'll demand access to entity technology. They'll embrace changes that make their lives easier and more comfortable. Marcus nodded grimly. By the time humans realize they've traded their freedom for security, the infrastructure for independence will have been dismantled. They'll be completely dependent on systems they don't understand, controlled by entities they trusted. The timeline wasn't inevitable, according to Underground Collins' elite analysis, but it was highly probable unless humanity developed widespread awareness of entity deception methods and conscious resistance to manipulation. That's why we're talking to you, Marcus said, and why we've been talking to researchers like you for 50 years. Information is the only weapon we have against this kind of psychological operation. After months of research and analysis, I found myself facing the same choice that every Collins elite researcher had faced since 1947. Accept the implications of what I'd learned, or find a way to dismiss it as paranoid speculation. The evidence was circumstantial but extensive. The pattern was consistent but complex. The implications were staggering but difficult to prove conclusively, and the personal costs of continued investigation were becoming increasingly apparent. My freelance work had dried up mysteriously. Dr. Martinelli had stopped returning my calls after someone complained about my misuse of university resources. My relationship was suffering under the strain of the long hours spent on research I couldn't fully explain. My sleep was disrupted by dreams that felt more like memories of conversations I'd never had. But I also couldn't ignore what I'd learned. If Collins' elite was even partially correct, then humanity was walking into the most sophisticated trap in recorded history. And if that trap succeeded, future generations would live in a world where human independence was not just restricted, but literally unthinkable. The choice, ultimately, was between personal comfort and collective responsibility, between individual security and species survival, between the easy path of accepting official narratives and the difficult path of questioning everything I thought I knew about humanity's place in the universe. I chose to continue the investigation. It's been 6 months since my first meeting with Marcus and Dr. Rodriguez, and I'm no longer the same person who stumbled across that footnote in a theological dissertation. The evidence I've gathered has convinced me that Collins' elite was not only real, but correct in their fundamental assessment of the UFO phenomenon. We are not being visited by benevolent space brothers seeking to help humanity evolve to a higher level of consciousness. We are being manipulated by entities that have been perfecting deception techniques for millennia, entities that view humanity as a resource to be managed rather than a species to be assisted. The current UFO disclosure movement, whatever the sincere intentions of its individual advocates, is serving entity interests by preparing humanity to welcome contact rather than question it. The technological solutions being offered through various contact scenarios are not gifts, but baits in an elaborate trap that will close once humanity becomes dependent on entity guidance. And the most terrifying aspect is that it's working exactly as planned. Public opinion is shifting in favour of contact. Government agencies are admitting UFO reality while avoiding UFO psychology. Scientific institutions are studying technological aspects while ignoring behavioural patterns. Religious leaders are embracing cosmic spirituality while abandoning traditional discernment practices. We are being prepared for our own subjugation, and we are enthusiastically participating in the preparation process. But knowledge of a deception campaign, even a sophisticated one, provides power to resist it. The entities Collins' elite studied were powerful and cunning, but they were not omnipotent. Their influence depended on human ignorance, isolation, and consent. When humans understood their methods and refused to cooperate, entity influence diminished significantly. The underground Collins elite has spent 50 years documenting entity weaknesses as well as their strengths. They've developed techniques for recognizing and resisting manipulation. They've maintained networks of communication and support that entity influence cannot completely penetrate. And most importantly, they've preserved knowledge that would otherwise have been lost or corrupted. That knowledge is now available to anyone willing to look for it, question official narratives, and think independently about humanity's future. The choice between freedom and security, between independence and dependence, between human agency and entity guidance remains open. But that choice won't remain open forever. According to every timeline the underground Collins elite has developed, we are rapidly approaching the point where collective consent for entity contact will make individual resistance increasingly difficult and ultimately ineffective. The time for choosing is now. The information needed to choose wisely exists, but it requires effort to find and courage to accept. The consequences of choosing poorly may be irreversible. 60 years ago, Collins' elite tried to warn us. Today, their successors are still trying. Whether humanity listens and whether we choose wisely remains to be seen. But the warning has been delivered. The evidence has been presented. The choice is ours. Maybe that's why you never hear their name in congressional hearings or disclosure reports, because Collins' elite wasn't warning us about aliens. They were warning us about faith in the wrong thing, and how easily it can damn us. The question isn't whether Collins' elite really existed. The question is whether they were right. And if they were right, then everything we think we know about the UFO phenomenon might be part of the very deception they tried to expose. The entities they described have had 60 years to perfect their strategy since Collins' elite was terminated. 60 years to learn how to work within our institutions, shape our research, and guide our conclusions. 60 years to make sure that when disclosure finally comes, we'll welcome it with open arms. Because that's what good servants do, they welcome their masters home. But servants can choose to be free. The question is whether they will make that choice while they still can. That's tonight's deep dive into the Collins elite. A story that challenges everything we think we know about the UFO phenomenon and asks uncomfortable questions about the nature of contact itself. What do you think? Was Collins' elite a real government program, or just an elaborate piece of disinformation? And either way, are the questions they were asking the ones we should be asking now? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to suggest topics for future episodes. Your ideas keep sleep theories going, and trust me, we've only scratched the surface of what's hidden in the footnotes of history. Until next time, sleep well and question everything.